Good morning and welcome to the 24th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The first item on our agenda is a decision on taking business in private. Our members agreed to take item 4 in private. Members have signified their agreement. The next item on our agenda today is to take evidence from 2 panels of witnesses on responding to long-term fiscal pressures as part of a pre-budget scrutiny 2026-27. We're joined today by Richard Robinson, Senior Manager, Audit Scotland, and Wal Souza, Deputy Director and Senior Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Fraser Avalander Institute. So I welcome you both to the meeting. We have your written submissions, so we'll move straight to questions. I'd like to begin by asking yourself, Mr. Souza, one of the things you've said, which is quite interesting, and it's a point I kind of put to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance last week. You said basically that no area of spending, according to the MTFS, is assumed to fall in real terms. All areas are presumed to grow in line with inflation, except those areas which are likely to grow more than that. And you talk about the areas such as NHS, social security, pay and local government. So basically what you're saying is that the MTFS is assuming that there's no prioritisation because everything is prioritised. So let me have your further thoughts on that.
I think you've kind of summarised pretty well what it does say, which is that I think the MTFS, the way we see it certainly, is that it's the first step in terms of doing the prioritisation, but it's not the prioritisation, right? So it's highlighted some areas which, and the total gap that must be filled. There's some questions as to whether this is really a central scenario, because if we know that the government should and must plan to have certainly its resource budget balanced every year. So we can take it as a guide to what's actually going to happen. We can take it as a guide to pressures, but as you said, it does mean that we await some detail on what the government actually wants to prioritise and deprioritise.
I mean, Mr. Robinson, you've kind of said something in a related kind of context. You said the Scottish Government will need to be clear in its future spending plans and financial strategies how each of measures such as increasing public value, identifying efficiency, productivity, service reform and prevention will be delivered. I just wonder again if you can tell us a bit more about your thinking on that.
Yes, and good morning, conveners. So very much in line with Joe, I think there's something about, I'll make 2 points if I may, one around flexibility and one about timing, which are a couple of points that we raised in the submission. The first about flex. So we produced a report last year on fiscal sustainability and reform. One of the investigation areas was what does the Scottish Government understand about where it can flex its budget. That's over time, over years and within years. And we found that the information wasn't there to the standard which we felt would allow them to do that in the most efficient way. It was useful last week to hear in last week's session around the level 4 analysis that is being done ahead of the spending review. There's potentials within that then to identify which elements of spending are more flexible to fixed. Why that's important is probably linking to the second point, which is about time and commitments. So it takes longer to reform against commitments, and this might include some of your workforce costs and how you're going to manage those over time, as opposed to your shorter-term changes that you may be able to make. I think the general point, going back to Joe's point, is that all of these measures should be geared towards the priorities that the Scottish Government want to see. So what would be useful as these plans develop towards the spending review in the IIP is to see a clear line between how each of these spending measures are addressing against those priorities, and also what that means for any refreshed national performance framework.
I mean, you touched on reform, and you've said in your submission that reform must deliver services differently, supporting the Scottish Government workforce to manage this change rather than simply doing more with less. Now, obviously, doing more with less probably is one of the things the Scottish Government is quite keen on. I think you know, that's understandable given the financial pressures. People want to see better services, but they don't necessarily want to pay for them to the extent that it might be required under current systems. So I just wonder if you can talk to us a wee bit about the kind of reform that you envisage.
So I think within the Pillar 1 work on the Financial Sustainability Delivery Plan, it gives some information about the different types of ways in which the Scottish Government would want to manage its spending over the short term. And some of those are efficiencies driven, which you could argue is more with less insofar as how you manage your workforce or the way that you operate differently. And some of those are slightly longer term in terms of potentially more systemic changes. What would I say? I think when it comes to workforce, and we produced a workforce report back in 2023. Apologies, I think the submission says 2003 when I reviewed this.
Yeah, I know. That's
is about a reduction in the workforce numbers on its own won't be enough to manage the gap, and also is existing alongside a continuing capacity issues within our public sectors, so services. So one of the things that we're saying is that spirit of reform, how are you going to use your workforce differently? How are you going to use your assets differently, which will be useful in terms of the single Scottish estate and the IAP plans, will all be key components of reform. And I think for us, however that develops over time, we want to see that clear line and alignment back to the MTFS and the ambitions that they've got for the medium-term picture.
Now, Mr. Sousa, you said that you know the devolved workforce will form by 0.5% a year, but this will have no effect on frontline services. And you said this seems implausible in the absence of some pretty heroic improvements in productivity. I mean, 0.5% a year doesn't seem that heroic, really. Now, I know it's not just 0.5% we're talking about, but you know, 0.5% over and above what productivity would be anyway. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through how we can deliver on that 0.5%. I mean, because you've talked about one of the things that I've raised many times in this committee, which is about compulsory redundancies, and you allude to that without saying it directly in the document. You go on to say there's no reason to suspect that the people retiring or leaving the Scottish public sector will be doing so in the roles that need eliminated. A real plan looking at the hard choices of what needs and does not need to be done, and how the skills for that match up with the ones available in the redeployment pool is what is necessary, and it seems to be missing from the fiscal sustainability delivery plan.
Yeah, so I think the fiscal sustainability delivery plan has the target of what it wants to the overall level of employment change in the public sector to be. But as I said in the submission, really, if we're thinking about reform and improving productivity, there needs to be a developed strategy as to where more roles need to be created and where fewer roles need to exist. And there needs to be a detailed thinking piece. And I appreciate that this takes time. And so I think what would be welcome from the Scottish Government would be an understanding of the fact that just taking the approach of will obviously no one is advocating for, you know, just go in and do a bonfire of roles. That would also not be a sensible way of doing things. It needs detailed planning. If you want to reduce roles, total employment by 0.5% a year, that is only the net figure. You need to think about what the gross figures in each bit of government will need to be for you to deliver. For example, technological transformation might require you to have a boost in those roles, and you might need to reduce other roles further. But I didn't get the sense from the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan that had been fully appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, you've said that the FSDP seems more like a disparate set of aspirations than a coherent plan.
Yeah, I mean, I stand by...
A bit cruel, really, you know.
It might be slightly cruel in some people's estimation.
Yes.
I think it's a fair reflection of the plan, in the sense that I said this in the submission as well, that I'm not totally sure why it needed to be a separate document altogether, given that it seems to try and tackle the medium-term gap, which itself is outlined in the medium-term financial strategy, which seems like an exposition of the problem rather than a strategy to combat the problem.
Well, Fraser Valdor has been very dogged in saying that it should be in the one document, so I do appreciate it. And Mr Robinson, what do you feel about these issues we've talked about in terms of productivity?
So I think starting with products, focusing maybe on the workforce a little bit, I think that was where the question started. There's something maybe to recognise in the trend of workforce within the aspirations to reduce it over the medium term. So what we've seen, and it's set out in the Scottish Government, the SFC's documents, as well as in our workforce report, is that understandably perhaps over COVID-19 and through the cost of living, we've seen an increase in staff numbers and staff costs over that point. So it's about a reversal of that in a way in terms of reducing.
But I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but understand that the public sector workforce is now some 47,000 higher than it was. So it's not about reversing it, it would be reducing it by 12,000 over 4 years. Reducing. So there'd still be a significant increase in the kind of workforce. So. Yeah,
I misspoke. Maybe reversing the trend is a better way of saying it. And that, I suppose, the context of that, and this is outlined by SFC, is a continuing demand for services which is going to stretch over the long term, potentially in relation to population health, which is one of the reasons why preventative measures are being measured. Probably the other factor to bear in mind is also that one of the reasons why this is a pressure is because of the relative position with the rest of the UK in terms of size of workforce and the relative pay of the workforces. So therefore, one of the things for the Scottish Government to keep an eye on and monitor over time, as well as demand and how managing demand, is how the relative demand in the rest of the UK is going to be monitored, because that will then affect how much funding is available for the existing workforce. So the main point is there's a lot of moving pieces, really, within this that the Scottish Government will need to manage over the medium term and then into the long term as pressures on public health, for example, increase.
I mean, sticking to workforce, you've pointed out that 16.8% of people aged 16 to 64 who were inactive reported that they wanted to work, and you touch on the no one left behind. But you went on to say a programme, but you've said it's unclear currently to what extent this will result in tangible or significant differences in labour market participation compared to the rest of the UK, and over what timescale?
Yes, I think it probably comes back to that point around the relative difference that this will make. Joe may want to speak further about this as well, because I think that some of this was covered in his submission. There's a relatively older population. There's impacts for that, for what it means for when people's incomes are growing as opposed to when they are plateauing or reducing as they move through their careers. There will be rest of UK measures in place to try to reduce or increase productivity, and so the relative impact that these measures will have will be really important. So the Scottish Government have outlined within their reports the population health element of it. How do we make people healthy and therefore available to work, and also how do we get people into the types of jobs with the skills that they need for the future. So these things are important, and monitoring their impact relative to the rest of the UK will be a big driver. I think this goes to perhaps obviously the MTFS and the FSDP are set up in a three-pillared approach, with the first being around spending, and the documents say that over the next couple of years that will be where most of the impact will be. Over the medium term and then into the longer term, tracking how those elements of the economy, wage growth relative to the rest of the UK in terms of the impact on taxes, will become increasingly prevalent. So managing that against the rest of the UK and the success of these measures as they transpire will be really important.
I mean, you've talked about in terms of Mr. Sousa, you've talked about in terms of people who are economically inactive. You've talked about a person-centred approach and the need for Scotland to emphasise skills in order to broaden the tax base. And you've also talked about how, for example, there's real problems in terms of capital formation. So I'm just, saying, especially in net terms, so I wonder if you can talk to us a wee bit more about that, because you go on to say, and I quote, UK capital spending remains lower, barely above replacement level, and so does Scotland's. Every year we invest less than peer countries. The gap in capital stock grows, which then results in the larger gap in productivity we see today.
Yeah. So, when you think about productivity, labour productivity, part of it relates to the amount of capital that is available per
Yeah,
worker.
driving a tractor is better than working with a pitchfork. You know.
Exactly. But it's not just that. It's not just physical capital, which obviously does have an impact, but it's investment in skills, kind of like lifelong keeping up of that training, adapting to new technologies. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that the amount of capital formation that we're talking about are either things that are very obvious or they're things that are very advanced. And the reality is somewhere in between, kind of like when you think about how many, when HMRC had to implement Making Tax Digital, one of the things they had to do was to try and get some people to do spreadsheets for their firms because they weren't doing them. So some of that digitization that happened in the 2010s is really way beyond when other firms digitized. So there's like a really long tail of firms, for example, who might not be using any of the digital tools that other firms have been using for years. So it's a very disparate set of things. But ultimately, if we need so some of these things depreciate over time, so you have to replace them. Be it your knowledge, be it your software that you're using, or the physical capital, the buildings, the roads, etc. So they need maintenance. So when you look and you try to take away our best measure of the depreciation rate, on net, we're actually not adding very much to the capital stock of the country. And that is the real issue. And that is something that has got progressively worse because and I appreciate this is a relatively complex thing to try and get across in this format, but you have the gross investment has not changed very much over the last 30, 40 years as a share of the economy. However, the things that we've tended to invest in tend to depreciate more quickly. There's a lot more software than there was before, for example, so it needs replaced more often. So that means that on net, we're actually not adding as much to the capital stock as we were in the 70s, 80s, which then means that we're still growing, but we're not growing as fast. And that's part of that productivity gap, is that we aren't adding to the capital stock available as much as we were before.
Yeah, and I mean, you've said that public investment is merely a fraction of private sector investment, and the UK is therefore reliant on capital from abroad, with the low productivity of the country also making investments less attractive. So because we're not getting enough capital investment, it deters the people we need to bring in more capital investment. So
yeah. So if you have something that's like really attractive, obviously that's got to get funded. What we're thinking about is like the things on the margin that might not be super attractive, but that would get funded domestically when there's less competition across the world for that capital. That's where kind of like the adding up of all those small measures kind of means that on the whole we end up with less investment than otherwise would be the case.
And Mr Robinson, you've said that the Scottish Government's own publication on the National Strategy for Economic Transformation notes that in 2019, while Scotland ranked 7th among OECD countries for higher education research and development, ranked only 24th for business enterprise research and development. Has been an advance on that since 2019?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. I can report back to the committee if there's any further information.
So basically there's concern that some of the figures we may be using may be considered a bit of date. And you've also went on to say, you talk about how the whole capital spending is forecast to create a gap of about £2.1 billion in capital investment, highlighting the importance of the prioritisation of capital spending towards the Scottish Government's priorities in the Scottish Spending Review 2025.
So in terms of... So a couple of points, if I may. The first one probably relates across to Joe's point, which is and the point we make in our submission, which is about alignment of all of these things. So although there are 3 pillars, as has been set out, they're all going to be related to each other. So what's happening with investment may affect the productivity in the country, what's happening with the economic strategies may affect that inward investment, and all of these things are going to then have tax implications which are going to then potentially support the budget. So the first point is really about that alignment. So when we see, and this takes us on to probably the point we're making around capital spending, when work was done by Audit Scotland on the investment plans and capital in the past, we've set out, we recommended that the Scottish Government should produce clear information that explains how it previously decided to prioritise, delay or cancel projects. And that's going to continue to be important, not just in the IIP itself, but then in the strategic decisions it makes over the medium term as this capital budget changes. We have the key priorities which the Scottish Government have laid out around poverty and climate change and growth in the economy and sustainable public services. Capital will be a big part of that. There's 2 sides to that. One is that the doom and gloom side, if you will, that there is a gap. And therefore, where are you going to prioritise projects to address that? The other is that what some people might call the shovel-ready projects. So if it ends up being not as bad as you thought it was going to be, which projects are you going to take off the paper and start with? So the idea of having a strategy that which allows you to do that in the way that best matches what your priorities of government are and what else you want to grow on the revenue side, whether that's through taxes or better public services, will be really important. So over the medium term, it will be useful to see these strategies continuing to align in that way.
Okay. I mean, Mr. Sousa, you've talked about, you know, in terms of capital, the difference between different types of infrastructure spend. I remember back in 2008 when we had the crash, there was everyone was talking about the gearing effect of certain types of capital projects relative to others. In other words, you invest in one type of capital, you get more return than in others. So basically, you've talked about road and rail connections, which are canonical examples. Public transport in particular has a high return. So you've also went on to talk about UK businesses' lowered investment skills over time, which I'm sure others will pick up on. But on this capital, given that there's going to be an almost certain to be a capital funding gap in the forthcoming year and beyond, where should we prioritise capital for the maximum amount of economic return?
So I think this really relates to how these projects are appraised by the Scottish Government. I can't tell you off the top of my head you should invest in project X or Y. What I can tell is that if you want to maximise the impact of those, you really need to look at the projects that you have already gone through the appraisal system, that are kind of ready to be put through into capital spending on the ground, and look and think, if we have a limited amount of money to spend, which are the ones that have the highest cost-benefit ratio? Obviously, that's not the only thing that you should look at, because when you look at the business case approach, I mean, as an economist, I'm pretty happy to recognize that it doesn't capture everything, and there are many things that are in the business case that aren't quantified. So don't just look at the quantification, but start with that as kind of an assessment point, and then look at any further benefits that you haven't been able to quantify. And if there, it's a question of aligning what those benefits are with what you want to achieve. So if you want to achieve maximum economic growth, then you should focus on the things that have that effect. If you want to maximize the protection for the environment, then you should focus on others. Like the Green Book and appraisal can't tell you this is definitely the best project to do. It can't tell you this project looks likely to break even in terms of social costs and social benefits. This project looks like it's way above, but obviously, like, the difference between 2.61 and 2.59 is, you know, to say that that's a real difference is fanciful, and that should be recognised as well. But it's kind of using that process and reviewing that process that has to have been gone through, because there's analysts in the Scottish Government that will be conducting that, and looking at them and going through a kind of a systematic prioritization exercise where you think, okay, this is kind of the list of things that we're going to do. These are the things that have the maximum impact. And also looking at the size of the projects as well, because it's all well and good to have one project that generates 300% returns, but if you've only invested £10 million, even if it's a very, very large return relative to the size that you invested, that might still be very small in the grand scheme of things. So you might want to combine both the size of what you're trying to do so that the return in pounds terms is bigger, even if the percentage return isn't necessarily as big as some other ones.
A lot of little projects might be a good idea then, it seems. But just one last thing from me, and it's on transparency. I'll stick with you, Mr Susie. You've said one of our main gripes with these documents is the lack of detail and access provided to external parties, such as us, to scrutinise underlying assumptions. Yeah,
so I think it would be really helpful to have, to be very clear and transparent about what's being assumed in some of these things. Now, we really welcome some of these steps that have been taken in the MTFS, where for the first time since there have been MTFSs, there has been an itemization of what's being assumed for different types of spending, but on the FSDP, it's less clear what the underlying assumptions are. And we really, and this kind of goes back, it makes me seem obsessed with spreadsheets, but we really love a spreadsheet or a table that we can just copy and paste, because we all
love numbers.
We had to type.
Always thinking numbers.
Convener, we had to type in the numbers for some of this stuff, and the risk that we make errors as well when scrutinising it quickly, I think, is a real issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Mr Robinson, just to finish with yourself, you've said that there are some clear consistencies between the MTFS, the Fiscal Sustainability Development Plan, and Public Sector Reform Strategy. In particular, the MTFS and FSDP both focus around the three pillars of prioritising spending, economic growth and tax strategy. But you go on later in your paper to say that to ensure effective public administration, you need to avoid duplication and ensure consistency in measurement and process.
Yes, that's right. And I think this is an inevitable risk from as the base of strategies grow, is that the strategies aren't aware of each other over time. And I think that alignment would then go through into this. So we speak in our submission, and we're aware that because it's in the Scottish Government's own documents about the population health strategies, the operational strategies, the reform strategies. We'll see the spending review in due course and the IIP. As the number of strategies grows, the risk that the alignment between them is lost increases. So it's encouraging, I think, into our submission that the PSR board is now taking a more central role than what we commented than was previously the case when we did our financial sustainability and reform report, and that's developing a theory of change and monitoring, evaluation and learning framework. So I think within those things, the ability for them to see across government, because a lot of these things are going to be cross-government measures, and be able to ensure that everyone's singing off the same hymn sheet, for want of a better term, will be really important.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to open out the session to colleagues around the table. First will be Michael, to be followed by Liz.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues. I start with the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan. Mr Robinson, you mentioned in your submission several areas where you think more detail would be required in the policy specifics. I wonder if you could set a little bit of those out for the committee.
So the MTFS is giving that broader spending and tax outlook, and the FSDP is useful in identifying certain areas where they would like to focus. So maybe two things. One would be the extent to which the variety of measures together, how far those are expected to go over the course of the 5-year period, and what the kind of range is within that. We're conscious when you're speaking about the more you move forward in time, the more difficult it is to project exactly. I'm not a forecaster, but I think that's fairly standard to say. So a sense of, well, how far will each of these measures go together collectively will help then to understand how they monitor that over time. And the second one is to understand the timing differences between these three pillars, which perhaps I touched on a little bit earlier. So to what extent within the FSDP and within the MTFS, when they are planning and strategising for an approach to the economy and taxes which will, relative to the UK, help with the fiscal gap, when will that start to come into being? So we're aware that obviously in the shorter term, because these things do take time, you may need to prioritise your spending decisions. We would note that that was also set out in the 2023 MTFS, that over the next couple of years it will be predominantly spending measures. So it's understanding at what point we can see the balance of weight between the pillars start to shift, which would then enable the Scottish Government to determine how in reality that balance between spending measures, economic growth and impact on taxation is transpiring over time.
I mean, has been in previous years a very volatile fiscal situation. I think this committee is very much cognizant of that. But the document is really written as a kind of a list of actions in the short run, rather than, say, for instance, a tolerance and list of assumptions or any kind of analysis of the background of assuming productivity growth of such and such versus it would allow us to obtain this form of output for input. It's very much focused, and this part of your commentary, I think, from both of you, on inputs rather than the output side of it. So it's really about managing that top level rather than actually seeing what the outcomes is. Is that a fair description? So
some things that I think are useful, which are, we've said there's certain things which are in these documents that weren't there previously, in terms of some more information about the workforce and what they understand it, some more information about the scenarios of spending. These things are useful. It's also useful to see that kind of breakdown, that table of actions at the back of the FSDP, I think it is. But I would agree that the timelines attached to those and the statements within it are statements of intent, statements of action. They're not necessarily timelines for impact. Which is slightly different. So there can be actions within certain periods and deadlines attached to that. Understanding over what time period and when over this 5-year period things will start to take effect will be useful. One thing that was useful, I think, is that we started to see an indication within the publications of what difference preventive measures could make in terms of pounds and pence over the longer term. I think one of the issues with not an issue, an inevitability with budgets and medium-term plans is that preventative measures and the costs will be shown in black and white, but the cost savings and benefits might exist beyond where the plans are. So to see that set out as well is useful, but that sense that we should expect a kind of monitoring against that and an understanding of when these things are starting to kick in will be important.
And in that list, there are things like 3% recurrent savings for NHS boards, a new approach to adult disability payments. Do you have any understanding of what those actually mean? Is that actually a cut to the budget of boards? Is it efficiency? Is there any idea?
I think that's probably one for the Scottish Government rather than ourselves. There might be more information in the spending review.
I agree with what Richard said. I don't know what impact that even would have and whether that's a deliverable. I don't think that the document is clear in terms of how deliverable that is. And I think one of the things that always kind of worries me sometimes with some of these documents is the idea that everything in the front line will always be preserved, and it's like, first of all, it's not clear that that's always going to be possible, but there's also you don't want your doctors to be writing their rotas or doing their HR, right? You need non-frontline services to allow frontline services to operate efficiently, and if you cut the back office, someone has to do the admin. And that is something that needs to be recognised when people say, oh, frontline services will be protected, or all the money is going to the front line.
So that's the operational side in terms
Yeah.
of where it might fall, and I don't think we have any real clarity on any of that. But the kind of the more macro side of this is that this has almost been written in as an assumption of a saving to obtain a target, this £1 billion target that seems to be set. But at the same time, the assumption is that health spending will continue to grow. Do you have an understanding of how those two things interact?
So I mean, it is possible. It's perfectly legitimate to have kind of targets that you set so that the leaders of those health boards will have something to aim for. And it's also possible that some of this is like the difference between net and gross pressures, right? Like the pressures might be £1 billion above the 4% growth that is built in. However, it's not clear from the document whether that really is the case. So not fully clear would be my assessment.
Given that commentary, should we be concerned that if we find ourselves in the budget period, the Cabinet Secretary presenting something to us saying, as in order to close the gap, this £1 billion is baked in, this £1 billion cut is baked in? Do you think that would be an acceptable approach from the government, given your concerns about the programmes?
I think it's right to expect from the government that it will be clear how they are going to address, in particular, the population health issues and that have been raised by the SFC and a big part of your scrutiny. I raise it in that way because population health will not just be the responsibility of spending within the NHS. It will be within education. It will be within police.
But this is focusing on the outcomes. I'm sorry, Mr. Robinson. Whereas actually my concern here is if we are presented with a supposedly balanced budget that mainstreams this £1 billion of savings. I mean, we've been heard from various sources so far doubts as to how deliverable some of this is, whether it be on pay policy, lack of clarity in terms of how actually it adds up to an overall figure. If they were to come back in, whether it be December or January, and say in draft budget form, this £1 billion has been, we're banking on this being saved, and therefore we can maintain the other figures, is that a credible approach?
I think it would be reasonable to ask those questions of the Scottish Government in terms of achievability and how it fits in with the approach, which is to address population health and some of these longer-term triggers that they've raised.
Mr. Sousa?
I would say that I would definitely expect that to be laid out clearly, that's been baselined. And if that is not the case, then the question should be asked is like how the two things stack up. I mean, I can't tell you right now, like, is that credible? Because it also depends on what overall assumptions for the rest of the budget are. But the question should definitely be asked as to how, if the budget then has further savings, say, well, can you deliver the savings that you've already baselined, and then on top of that, any further ones? That would be a reasonable question to ask.
So we've had 3 years now of emergency cuts statements from the Scottish Government around about this time of year, it's fair to say. I'm hearing reports from the civil service of lots of very urgent meetings with very significant budget cuts being proposed within departments. Do you think that there's a threshold at which point the government would have to return to Parliament and say that there are significant challenges in delivering the current budget in terms of us being able to understand and scrutinise that?
I mean, it's very difficult for me to comment on any meetings that might or might not be happening. But I share the frustration about like the continual emergency statements, which at some point can't be emergencies anymore if they're happening every year. So that does raise some questions about like whether and it's something that we raised last year as well, was whether there's kind of like too little a gap for contingencies that's being built in. Yeah. And I appreciate that that it is difficult for the government, and certainly will require some sort of like willingness to say that upfront, that you can't allocate the full budget because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
That certainly, I would say, is a very sensible way of doing it, but I appreciate that politically that can be very difficult. However, I would then put it back to politicians to say that this is your role to make the case for that. But I can't tell you if there's a particular threshold where they will need to get back.
Mr. Robinson, anything particular on that?
Probably not on the threshold point. I don't think we'd have a view on that. I think that it probably goes back to that point on flex. So it's about so what we have seen in the last 3 years, and I know this has been subject of committee inquiry and pre-budget scrutiny work, is a period where there were a number of significant in-year movements and volatility within it. Whether or not that continues is one for other people to understand through forecasts, etc. The importance of clarity over in-year movements is important. The importance of flexibility about what you can stop or shovel-ready projects start during the year is important. We've seen, during the cost of living crisis, that there was an emergency budget which we highlighted as something that was useful insofar as it allowed a scrutiny of the changes, but also within the context of what that would mean for, say, qualities considerations, for example. So those things were useful, but I think some of it will depend on the extent of the volatility that occurs within in the year for the Scottish Government to consider how to act.
Okay, thank you. Just to close then, on the MTFS, I think it was yourself, Mr. Sousa, who's said regarding this lack of prioritisation that the convener highlighted, I think you've both mentioned in submissions, you say in practice it cannot really be true. The MTFS thus continues to seem more like a political statement to manage expectations across the public sector rather than a true setting of the course of public finances. Is that a tenable position to take? Should we be seeing that in the spending review come the publication? Do we need to see a departure in approach for the management of those public accounts?
I certainly would expect that the spending review would be certainly. I mean, we would have hoped that the MTFS would have had more detail on that, as we said in the submission. It does seem like its role has become more of like highlighting all the difficult things that are coming down the track rather than strictly speaking a strategy for dealing with them. But we certainly would expect at the spending review for this prioritisation to be addressed. I mean, the whole point of the spending review is to set out the priorities of spending for the Scottish Government.
Would you agree, Mr. Robinson?
Yes, I think there's something about setting these documents, I may sound like a dripping tap here, but setting that alignment between these different documents for different purposes. So I think the MTFS is useful in setting out the Scottish Government's take on the scale and makeup of the outlook it faces over the next 5 years, supported by the Fiscal Sustainability Plan, which gives some further information about the types of actions that they may want to pursue to address that over the medium term. What then will need to sit underneath that will be, whether that's through budgets or the spending review, is that granularity of spending intentions and priorities that maps across to that, as well as any other strategies that may come in relation to economic contributions and tax and building on tax strategies that have taken place early in the year.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Liz to Fulham Shell.
Thank you. Do you think there should be more focus on zero-based budgeting when it comes to addressing what you've just said about the economic impact of specific spends and how they articulate with the government's priorities, as you mentioned earlier, not least in terms of the effectiveness of these spends, but also in terms of the opportunity costs, which you said were very difficult to measure?
I certainly would hope that there would be some move towards a zero-based review, at the spending review. I think that's certainly been the approach that's been, I would say, has had broad support across the UK in terms of the way that these things are meant to be delivered in spending reviews. That's the overarching kind of architecture of our spending system. I am worried by the timing of the spending review, not because of the length of years that you spent to cover. We said in our submission that we actually would welcome, despite the recommendations a few years ago that you shouldn't go beyond the end of a parliament, given the fact that there's been so long without multi-year budgets. We would welcome multi-year budgeting. I think the issue is the amount of time that the Scottish Government will have for conducting that review, and whether that will be enough to really conduct a full zero-based review. My view is that it isn't, because from looking at how long they will have to actually conduct any review, be it whether the budget, because the spending review will come out, as I understand it, alongside the budget. So regardless of whether it's in December or January, that doesn't seem anywhere near enough time to post the UK budget to conduct that. So that's a worry.
Do you share that view, Mr Robinson?
I think it would be reasonable for the Scottish Government to take what it thinks is the best approach based on a number of factors, and one of those might be timeliness and timescales attached to that. I think when in the session last week, I think it was raised about the level 4 budget analysis as a step towards a better understanding of how spending decisions are working together and could be prioritised. I think that is a good step. I think with all of these things, any government will have to make a constant analysis of the acuteness of the pressures and how that's changing over time, and it may choose to adjust course in due course. I think a more granular understanding, though, of where the flexibilities in the budget is helpful to them understanding and being able to plan more proactively against their priorities, how they may want to increase or decrease spending if the path of the next 5 years is different to the one that's been set out.
Do you think there's anything that's impeding effective zero-based budgeting in terms of the data that we require to ensure that policies can be measured in their effectiveness? And obviously the other side of the coin is that if that spending takes place, there's a reduction in spending elsewhere. Do you think we have the right data to be able to make these assessments? Because we've had discussions at this committee about some of the data, particularly when it comes to things like the labour market. It's maybe not as good as it should be.
So I think the labour market statistics situation is a real worry. I think I mentioned it in our submission that in some sense we can know very little from the labour force survey about what's going on in the labour market in Scotland. We can know a bit from the real-time information from HMRC, but that's not a complete data set. And there's a reason we've always conducted this survey, and in particularly with things that require you asking people about the reasons for this. So, for example, if you want to tackle, say, ill health, making people unable to work, you can't just go to the admin data set and say, why is this person not working? You know, you have to ask them. And that means that you have to have a survey. And then, therefore, you need to have a way of making that representative. And so I am... What can we do in the absence of that? I mean, it would not be a good set of outcomes if we just said, well, we can do nothing on employability because of that. That clearly isn't the right answer. I think we should be, we should expect ministers to be open about the judgment call that they're making to you in the committee, saying, we don't necessarily know exactly what's going on, but our view is that this is really important, and therefore we're still prioritizing it, but recognizing that that is an area where they might have to change their view. And I think it would then also, it would be helpful for there to be an environment where if the evidence regarding that changes, that is recognized. And I think you know, it's just something where people are kind of going, like driving with kind of not all the directions and with some of the windscreen obstructed. I mean, you still are hoping that you're going the right way, but if something comes out that tells you that you're not, you should be able to put on the brakes.
Can I ask about a comment that the Cabinet Secretary made in her evidence last week at committee, and this was in relation to the free school meals policy. I know you can't comment on that specific policy, but she said, and I quote, "We will not be able to roll out the universal offer as far as we had previously wanted. We were going to have to prioritise those most in need." Without going into the details about free school meals, can I just ask if you think it would be helpful to have a debate about the effectiveness of universalism, because technically what that does is to measure, to go back on my original questions, it measures where the policy intention is having the most effect, as the Cabinet Secretary was implying, and perhaps less effect when it's being given to people who don't require that universal benefit. Do you think that would be helpful?
I think it would be helpful. I think it's very reasonable for people to disagree about whether universal versus targeted provision is deliverable, and I know there's different views across the committee, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think it's important to articulate why you think that in a particular area you might prioritise universal benefits or services versus targeted, and how much more you're getting in terms of coverage, for example, because one area that always comes up is free prescriptions, which actually, when you look at the data, for example, for England, turns out I think something like 90% of prescriptions are free anyway. Yep. So there's some areas where universal provision seems like it's a lot more than it actually is, and there's some areas where it encompasses a lot more of that provision than a targeted approach would have.
That said, that there are aspects of universal provision where money could be saved. Particularly, well, actually, to go back on the free school meals issue, this was not part of the Cabinet Secretary's evidence. Local authorities will tell you that when it comes to the provision of free school meals, if you look at the number of free school meals that are not actually being used to those who potentially are entitled, there's quite a lot of waste in the system. And I would cite that personally as an example of where money perhaps could be saved. But the real point is about whether the focus on universalism, which might in theory sound very, very helpful, it actually creates problems for the long-term fiscal sustainability of the country. And we are surely in a very difficult period for that sustainability. So I'm just asking if you think that perhaps some aspects of universalism have to be reviewed.
I think all areas of public spending should be looked at on a regular basis. And I think the approach of like universal delivery versus targeted delivery should definitely be something to discuss. Now, there's as I said, and it kind of relates to what you're saying, that there's areas where that universal delivery can have a much bigger impact than in others in terms of overall spending and overall effectiveness. Again, the decision as to whether to proceed or not is a political one, and one that I can't comment on.
Sure.
But it's, I mean, I don't think there should be any qualms about having a review point and saying, should we do this? And if the answer is yes, then the answer is yes. Having a review is, I know often it gets coded as like, this is what we're going to cut, but it's just good practice to keep things under review anyway.
Yeah. Good, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle, to follow by John.
Good morning. Mr Sousa, I just wanted to talk to you briefly about the issues around the wider UK economy. It's anticipated that the UK black hole is 41.2 billion, debts around 2.7 trillion. We've seen the kind of yield on 30-year bonds. Potentially there could be a sovereign debt crisis, and you've referenced the kind of very late now autumn statement with the potential impact here. I suppose one of the things that worries me is we tend to take a very near-side view on some of the challenges of the Scottish Government without looking at the bigger picture. So I'd appreciate your reflections on that economic reality. I mean, and there's a very good reason why there's going to be a very late autumn budget, I would suggest. I'd appreciate your reflections and therefore casting that back to some of the complexity and uncertainty that the Scottish Government needs to deal with.
Yeah, so I think the black hole, quote unquote, that you mentioned, the potential gap towards hitting the fiscal rules, the 40 billion, that's from the National Institute of Economic Research. I think the general consensus is that it's probably less than that. Some of the assumptions that they used, although reasonable to make them, most people would say that they're towards the top end, and probably we're looking, depending on what the OBR does, the Office of Budget Responsibility does in terms of revising productivity growth, which I should say, in my view, needs to be revised down anyway, because it clearly is an assumption that has been too high for too long. But depending on what they do, we might be looking at 20-odd billion pounds. I think some of the challenges can be. I mean, I think all of these things look difficult, but they're not an acute fiscal crisis. They're kind of more of a slow burning issue. The 30-year gilts, although headline grabbing, I would say the UK sells very little now of 30-year gilts, so it doesn't actually affect, and we looked at this last week in some analysis that we did. Actually, most of of what's happened is kind of investors in general trying to divest from very long-term bonds towards shorter-term bonds, which actually slightly maybe helps the selling of UK bonds, because we're selling more 10-year bonds than we used to. But nevertheless, it looks like a relatively challenging budget that the UK government has to deliver, particularly if you want to not change spending, because, well, I think it would be fairly difficult to reopen the spending review settlement. If it doesn't want to raise any of the taxes that raise 2/3 of revenue, and doesn't want to borrow anymore. I mean, something's got to give here. Not all these things are achievable the way that they're set out. And then the other thing that, you mentioned how this links with the Scottish Government. It's an interesting characteristic of the fiscal framework that the larger devolution of tax, in particular, has caused the Scottish Government's budget to be more linked with UK conditions rather than less. Because what matters is the net position between the tax revenues raised in Scotland and the forecast for that, and the forecast for England and Northern Ireland revenues in particular, that the OBR does. So that means that it's obviously more difficult for the Scottish Government to plan for this. However, my counter-argument to some of this would be, this is a product of the fiscal framework, as it exists. It's been agreed by both parties, and therefore you have to plan for the fiscal framework that you have, rather than the one you wish you did or that you think would be better. I mean, you can make the case for why it should be better, but you still have to deliver within those constraints. And ultimately, the Scottish Government is responsible for balancing its budget in particular. So I think I really appreciate the challenges, and I think it can lead to what is, from an economic point of view, what can be bad policy, because you have to adjust things in a way that you might not necessarily want to. But the risk is there to begin with. And so that I think it's important to recognize that as budgets are being planned, right? Because ultimately, if something happens in the autumn budget or something happens in March, the Scottish Government has to have a plan for what it's going to do with a change in consequentials or whatever it is.
And I suppose following on from that, Mr Robinson, I mean, obviously in your audit perspective, you are uniquely placed to take the view that the best predictor of future behaviour is based on past behaviour. Setting, you know, looking at the kind of context, what do you sense is the appetite, based on reading the documents that we're discussing today, for real substantive change against perhaps keeping the ball bouncing in the light of some of the considerable uncertainty and complexity we've got? Based on, I know you have long experience in your career, but do you think there's a real appetite for change, or are we just in the necessary part, not that far away from an election where we can bounce the ball beyond the election?
So I think that's outside of my remit to say. I think that it's fair to say that the Auditor General has in the past commented on an implementation gap between the intentions and ambitions of reform and the realities of them. I think it's useful that we can see this year a publicly set reform strategy alongside the financial sustainability development plans. I think it would be useful to see what is in the spending review insofar as how it matches that ambition that's set out in the PSR and the MTFS. And just to comment, I think, on the last point, which is around all of this is within the context of everything else that's happening outside of Scotland as well as within it. The relative performance of the rest of the UK really matters in a number of ways. One will be relative tax policy, whether or not there'll be any issues in relation to devolved taxes that come through any UK government decisions, impact on economic growth based on some of the things that you talked about earlier, and also the impact on spending of any changes that the UK government may choose to improve its own fiscal situation, which you set out. The SFC did set out a little bit about what that would mean, and it makes it much more difficult for the Scottish Government over the long term if the path of the UK Government relates to low levels of spending, for example, to address that fiscal. So I think, in summary, it's really important for the Scottish Government to be flexible, aware and aligned to what could come down the track, and to be reflecting that constantly through their MTFSs as live documents, really, to understand how that's going to, and within that notion of keeping that firmly planted in the principles of those outcomes, whether that's set out through the National Performance Framework or the priorities that they have within their MTFS.
I won't go into the National Performance Framework because I know there's other areas of consideration there, but I just wanted to pick up on a kind of finding that this committee brought out some months ago, and that talks back to the questions I'm asking about appetite. It became clear, I forget whether it was the Cabinet Secretary for Finance or the Minister for Public Sector Reform, that workforce numbers, in fact I think it was the Permanent Secretary, the former Permanent Secretary, workforce numbers are in the exclusive preserve of the civil servants rather than government. In other words, they have the final say over headcount. And I thought that was a very good example of complexity. Government may say this is what we wish to do, but if the civil servants do not wish to deliver on that, actually they are ultimately accountable. I can sense by your face, Mr Sousa, that that's also news for you, but that seems to me to be quite fundamental as an example of, whilst government may set out some good plans, that it may not be able to deliver. I don't know if that was known to yourself, Mr Robinson, but I think that is an important point that all of us in Parliament should remember.
So I don't know the details of that particular exchange. I think one of the things that we did a piece of work on workforce challenges in a couple of years back now. I suppose at the fundamental level, what is the right level of workforce that you need to deliver services? And that will rely on a whole host of services, of other decisions that affect that. So, for example, if we use, or if an organisation uses digital in a certain way, that might reduce their workforce need. If they choose to prioritise a growing workforce over reductions in other parts of the budget if they deem that fit in the right strategy, as long as they can manage it within their budget. Having that element of flexibility to do that is important. So I wonder whether some of that might have been coming out in that conversation. I don't know. I think it's more about the workforce being an important and in terms of budget an important, but in terms of delivery of services, important factor, and how each public organisation works with the Scottish Government to understand what is the correct level that they need to deliver the services, including how they might choose to change the way that they deliver services, whether that's through digital new ways of working or what have you.
I think you're absolutely bang on in what you say. You're illustrating by example some of the considerations you might make when you're undertaking reform and mapped against continued delivery. But I suppose the point I'm making is, from a public administration point of view, are we missing a trick by going back to the way we thought things were, i.e. ministers, cabinet secretaries set the priorities and attempt to deliver against them? It's very difficult. In removing the civil servants and the former permanent secretary in this example, making sure that they too are part of the mix, because if it comes down to accountability and final say in the case of headcount, that to me is quite fundamental as to how we assess the probability of delivery. And I've not really heard, there's not really general discussion about understanding that complexity in the normal way of doing things.
Yeah, I think your point about headcount could be made more generally about all government priorities, right? That you have to have alignment between the people setting the overall direction and the policy, and the people delivering the policy, and those are the civil servants, and not just civil servants, broader public sector as well. So in the health service as well, lots of them aren't civil servants; they are members of, or employees of the NHS. But I mean, in some sense, you have to bring those people that are going to deliver with you and sell them the vision that you want to do. And I appreciate that's a really difficult thing to do, but I mean, just speaking from my personal experience, when I worked in the public sector, I saw people really willing to go the extra mile all the time to deliver ministerial priorities. Sometimes the ministerial priorities end up being in conflict, which can be a difficult thing to do, particularly when there's the financial side of things goes one way, but then all the things that need to be delivered are the same. So like that priority then comes back to what is more important, hitting the budget line or delivering on the outcomes. And at different times, those probably have different weights. But again, I think in some sense that also comes back to ministerial priority setting and being really clear about what is most important.
Yeah, except inevitably turkeys don't generally for Christmas. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. John, to be followed by Craig.
Thank you, Convener. I think both of you refer to the question of population health and refer back to what the SFC said, which was broadly that improved population health measures can improve the Scottish Government's long-term fiscal position, presumably if more people get to work and so on. So, I mean, Mr Robinson, from your experience, have we ever been able to improve health substantially? And can we have any optimism at all going forward that we could do it in future? Because it seems to me that we have problems like obesity and diet and lack of exercise amongst young people and mental health much higher up the agenda now, and it doesn't look like we're going in the right way.
So it's a big question, and it might be one that people in public health would have more expertise in than I. Anecdotally, I'd look back on levels of smoking, I suppose, when I was a young man and smoking myself versus what it is now. Those seem to be lower levels now. But the nature of the issue will change. I mentioned about obesity in the FSDP. has set out what the benefits could be of prevention working. So I think there are examples, whether that's through changes in social behaviour, whether that's the advances of medicine, or whether that's through the activities of government and legislation that have made a difference to certain elements of health. That doesn't mean, I don't think, that there aren't benefits to prevention at a population health level, and I think that it's right to expect that correcting that will help in a number of ways, whether that is as set out by the SFC and the Scottish Government, whether that is through levels of devolved benefit take-up, whether that is the market participation, or whether that is the spending on NHS services directly.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Mr Sousa, a number of us met GPs yesterday in the Glasgow area, and you know, one of the practices said, I think, if I've got the numbers correct, they still have the same as they had 25 years ago, which is 9 GPs and 25,000 patients, but they are absolutely overwhelmed because it's like the needs or the expectations and what the NHS can do is just growing and growing and growing.
Yeah, to your point before, have we ever been able to improve population health? I mean, I think we have over the long term. Like, infant mortality used to be huge, and it isn't now. And not just that, we've also become, I think it's fair to say, a lot better at allowing people to participate in the labour market in important ways that they weren't able to beforehand. So, for example, if you had a factory where you had an industrial accident, you might never be able to work again. But today, you can have ways of participating in the labour market where that is kind of worked around a lot more, and the rise of office working, for example, has meant that many more people can participate in the labour market without having to have physically intensive jobs. So I think there are some good news there. I appreciate that when you then said, people are still being, many more people are accessing the health service. Part of it is because they also live longer than they used to, which means that it's kind of good news, but it comes with financial costs, and that's just what happens. People live longer, they end up being able to live with conditions that mean that they interact with one another. But I think ultimately, there's a difficult challenge, and that's something that is recognised in the SFC's projections, but also in the OBR's projections, which actually kind of drive a lot of the assumptions that the SFC makes about long-term health demand, which is that with an older population with more complex conditions, it just means that there's more demand for the health service. That's been recognised by the fact that the health service budget has grown more strongly than pretty much any other budget in government, and that seems to likely to continue to be the case. Now, health is about, I don't know the exact figures off the top of my head, but I think 7 or 8% of GDP at the moment. I mean, it probably will be like 15% in 50 years' time. And, health is a necessity, so people will always flock to that. And then the question is, how do we deliver that in the most efficient way, in a way that is financially sustainable, yes, but also addresses the health demands of the population. I appreciate that there's also a lot to be able to do in one go, but it's kind of like the social policy challenge of the next 50 years.
So, I mean, you've emphasised with older people and the complex needs and all that kind of thing. What about the working age population? I mean, from an economic point of view, purely, apart from demand for health, getting more people back into work who can't work at the moment because of health. I mean, is that realistic? Are we making progress on that?
So some of that is realistic. I think we probably can't expect to just get 100% or anywhere near 100% of the working age population into work. Nor should we, because even if you think over the long term, like people might need some time out of the labour force and to then be able to get back, or they might have, they might legitimately decide that they want to retire earlier, for example, or things like that. But I think it is realistic. Are we making progress on that? I refer you to my statement to your colleague before about what we know about the labour market, which sadly is very little. So I don't know whether we're making as much progress as we'd like to, but I would love to have a survey that would tell us one way or the other.
Okay. And I mean, you mentioned infant mortality where we have made progress, but right at the beginning of your submission, you also referred to the infant birth rate, which seems to be exceptionally low in Scotland, but I think is low throughout a lot of the Western world.
Yeah.
Have any other countries managed to reverse that trend?
Not fully reverse that trend that I'm aware of. Personally, I mean, I'll happily stand corrected if that's not the case. But my understanding of all these policies that they might change things at the margin, but only very slightly. I mean, I think if you look at infant mortality over time and the birth rate, they're very well negatively correlated, so that over time. That as infant mortality has fallen, so actually positively correlated. As one falls, the other falls. But also as more women have gone into the labour force, then that has also meant that the birth rate has dropped. These are choices that people have made, and I don't know that we can or necessarily should. Make massive changes to this, because a lot of it comes down to individual choice. So we kind of have to take some of this as given and just design policy with that in mind.
If you want to come in, I think, Mr. Robertson.
Very briefly, just probably to reiterate that these are also issues that are affected the rest of the UK, even though there is a slightly different population demographic makeup. Any of those measures that aim to support people towards better health is good in and of itself, but in terms of the difference it makes to the budget, it might be in terms of how that applies differently to the Scottish demographic, or what particular Scottish government interventions there are that don't take place in the rest of the UK, which may give a benefit to Scotland. And I suppose the other thing, which is the obvious point, which is, although I try to catch myself sometimes insofar as all these things have fiscal benefits and budgetary impact, but also on just a standard line against the Scottish Government's priorities around poverty and the benefit of people working to extricate themselves from poverty. There's benefits beyond the budget and the spending that would potentially help with people's poverty and child poverty, as we know, which would be useful to understand.
Okay, thanks. And moving kind of on from that, following on from that, you make the point, Mr. Sousa, the focus on how much is spent rather than results is as true for health as it is for social care, the latter being a particularly interesting case in Scotland, where government spending per person is around 50% higher than England, yet little evidence exists of differences in outcomes. Are we really saying there's no improvement better?
No. So the point I was trying to make there is that the question should be asked of whether the level of additional spending is reflected on the level of difference in outcomes, and whether that is a worthwhile. So all of this is, there's. I agree that there is a good case that there should be, that there are probably slightly better outcomes in Scotland, and that's something that should have been reflected in the submission.
I mean, I don't know if you were thinking of including something like the Scottish Child Payment in there, because there's been arguments that...
Yeah, so there's lots of arguments that can be made about that, but ultimately I think the question is a broader one, which is the focus on outcomes really is one that's really important, rather than just the focus on inputs.
Yeah.
that's what I would like you to take away from that, rather than any specifics on like debates of measurement there.
Okay, fair enough. And the other area I wanted to touch on was just the fiscal framework, which has already been mentioned, and I think it was yourself that said it was agreed by both parties. I mean, I think that is maybe up for discussion. But
I said it was signed by both parties, I think.
Yes. But, I mean, I suppose my question is, does it need to be fundamentally changed? I mean, there was not a major review last time. The whole point about we are so focused now, we have to compare our economy, how's it growing in comparison to rest of the UK, which largely is influenced by London and the South East. My personal feeling is we can never compete with London and the South East, we never have. And therefore, is there something, and I don't know if this is a political question, in which case you can't answer it, but are we needing a fundamental review of the fiscal framework?
I think that you're right that it wasn't like a fundamental review last time. However, there were some changes that were made that I think all sides agreed were sensible, including the linking to inflation of some of the limits. I think whether it's desirable or not, as you rightly intuited, is beyond my remit to say. I think you could imagine it working differently. Whether that's something that's deliverable or not is a different matter. I would just come back to the point that I made to your colleague before, which is that regardless of whether one thinks that it should be fundamentally reformed or not, in the meantime, things have to be addressed in this fiscal framework, and maybe you can then make an argument as to whether you think that is too much for the fiscal framework to bear, in which case you might think that it is reformed, or you might think that it is deliverable. That's more of a political question than an economic question.
Mr Robinson, the borrowing levels and reserves and things have been tweaked, but we've been warned that there could be 850 million negative reconciliation coming down the line. Yeah. I mean, is that something we should be worried about?
So I think the volatility is something, the new risks as well as opportunities that came with devolving of taxes is something that we've commented on in the past, including that kind of sense of that volatility about how you manage the movement between the years. So it's right to say that if that transpires, and I think there was some talk last week about whether it would, let's keep a watching brief, then that would be slightly beyond what were the borrowing levels. I think there's also something about understand the purpose of the borrowing and reserves powers. So whether they are adequate or not is for other people as opposed to auditors to comment on, was to allow some sense of smoothing between the years. So one of those might be, although we talked about borrowing powers, we know that from the 2023-24 year in the outturn, from that we're expecting an upward of 400. So part of it might be, well, how do you use your reserves and how do you use those types of things to reflect the fact that some years you'll be up and some years you'll be down, as opposed to potential saying, well, in the years that we're up, we'll put it to our budget, and if the years that we're down, we'll borrow it. If that is what the Scottish Government policy is, then that's what it is. But I think there's something about the clarity about how it will use its reserve powers to, as well as its borrowing powers to help manage the inevitable fluctuation that you'll see as the difference between forecasts and outturns will always be.
I mean, again, I don't want to ask you about anything that's political, but I mean, from a purely technical point of view, the fact that the limit of either borrowing or reserves is only going up by inflation, while we've taken on a lot more responsibilities, do you think is that realistic or practical?
I think that's probably one for the Scottish Government to consider the adequacy of that. We'd probably look at how the Scottish Government are managing against the powers that they currently have, and so far the forecasts and the adjustments that have to be made for outturns have been managed through budgets and through the borrowing, but whether or not the Scottish Government feels that's sufficient in the future and wishes to have further conversations about the fiscal framework would probably be beyond our remit.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much. Now, I do have to say, John, I think public health has advanced phenomenally in the last century or so. Life expectancy in 1900 was 47 in Scotland, and in that year, the city you represent, 14 people died of plague. We've since managed to eliminate scarlet fever, diphtheria, smallpox has been eradicated worldwide, polio, penicillin's been discovered, insulin, cancer deaths a lot lower, heart attack a lot lower, diets are better than ever. It's not just about, you know, things like child mortality. I think, well, there's still issues, but it's not quite how it actually was back in the day. My dad's sister actually died of scarlet fever. I don't think many people die of that in Scotland now. Okay, Craig, the late Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Convener, and I'll make sure that I will make sure that life expectancy I'm now worried about. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. The government is setting a significant store in order to balance its budget, looking at the Scottish Government and the public sector workforce. But in your submission, you say that it notes that more detail on the size and cost of the workforce is useful and aids scrutiny. However, and I quote, an approach focused purely on controlling workforce numbers and pay costs will not address capacity issues and is unlikely to be sufficient to put public finances on an even keel. Could you elaborate on that and say, therefore, what more should be done in relation to both workforce and elsewhere to try and get the public finances on an even keel?
So, I think in general terms, the Financial Sustainability Delivery Plan and the MTFS are quite clear that while they intend to use workforce change as part of the mix, that it won't be enough to manage the entirety of that mix, even though more clarity around sort of the relative impact of that over time could be given. We produced a report back in 2023 on workforce challenges. One of the things that was clear to us from looking at where the workforce is, how it's deployed and how much it's paid, is that the nature of reform and how reform affects the workforce is as important as what could be a more simple but potentially more difficult just cutting of numbers across the board and continuing to provide services in the way that they do. So in the report we give some examples of digitisation of services, helping to move staff into other areas. There's more potentially in terms of AI, and I'm aware that the Scottish Government will have AI and digital strategies in place. I think what's important, and it probably goes back to the earlier questions about what's the correct workforce with the correct skills and the correct numbers, is that will likely evolve depending on what type of service and levels of services and how they provide services happens. So I think our point here is that while the workforce will need to evolve and reform, and the consideration about the affordability of it, that will need to be on constant review against the broader reforms that they wish to see within the Scottish public service.
Yeah. I think that leads me on to my next question is, if you're talking about size, scale and function, one bit that seems to be missing from the debate is productivity of the Scottish Government workforce. I mean, what more do you think the Scottish Government, supported by bodies such as yourself, could be doing to look at the productivity of the workforce rather than just simply the size and the cost of it?
So I think, and I wonder whether Joe may want to come in on this as well, is that there has been a trend of productivity in our last year's NHS in Scotland report. We looked at what the productivity was. There may be some, we would expect to see more on that, I think, especially through the efficiency strand that the Scottish Government have set out in its FSDP. Whether that is working differently, working with technology, whether that has a capital or infrastructure element to it, we would expect that to be within the mix of how it considers efficiencies. So if efficiencies are going to be about productivity, a bit of the earlier statement about more with less, as well as potentially a restriction in services, we'd probably expect to see a whole number of elements that factor into that. But I think it's fair to say there have been some concerns both in the public sector and the private sector in relation to productivity of late, and it's an important thing to address.
I would agree with a lot of that, well, with pretty much all of that. I think productivity really obviously is important, but and it would be important in delivering more with less or the same with less. And that's something that the Scottish Government should definitely aim for. I think sometimes there's a challenge in the public sector that is one that is different, and I think that's been recognised across the world as we saw across the pond in particular, kind of people stopping doing things. The government can't stop doing some things that are inefficient until it has an alternative for it, and that's a challenge that has to be recognised, and that's something that really drives some of that slower productivity growth, which is understandable because there's a trade-off between growing your productivity and having provision for everyone that needs provision, because the public sector has to have that universal approach. So that's something to bear in mind when we look at overall productivity figures for the public sector as well.
Is there a cultural issue emerging now that relates to productivity but also pay and conditions between the public sector and the private sector in Scotland? When you see organisations like BlackRock now saying they want staff back in the office 3 days a week, senior management 4 to 5 days a week, we see a different culture perhaps emerging within the Scottish Government. We had the Permanent Secretary who discussed how difficult it was to get civil servants to agree to go back into the office. We see potentially a reduction in the working week in terms of number of days. We've seen a reduction in the working week in terms of number of hours. Is there a sense, though, that the culture that is emerging both in the public sector and the private sector in Scotland do seem to be at variance, and will that have some impact upon the government's ability to deliver productivity and efficiencies through the public sector, in your view?
It's not something that we've covered specifically at this point. I think it's useful for the Scottish Government and all public sector organisations to keep a watching brief on whether or not the working arrangements are helping or hindering productivity. I think I've probably heard anecdotally about, in some cases, working from home increasing the ability of people to work, and that's also maybe reflecting things like other caring responsibilities that people hold, which enable them to work potentially when they wouldn't have been able to, or take a different way of doing it. I understand there's another side to that, which is the extent to which that kind of cross-pollination of ideas in an office can take place. I think it would be an interesting idea, an interesting area of research for the Scottish Government to explore. We haven't done any more work on that at this point.
Okay, thanks. One of the other areas, obviously, that you identify and the Scottish Government identified as potentially helping to save their bacon is this pivot towards preventative spend. Where I've struggled is when I've listened to ministers discussing this, is the actual definition of what is preventative spend and what is spending on perhaps problems that have got a significant acuity. So take an example, let's say the prescription of Manjaro on the National Health Service. You could say that is dealing with a problem of obesity that could have been dealt with earlier, but equally you could argue that is preventative spending because it stops the acuity and the health issues that could arise out of somebody remaining clinically obese for a significant period of time. Do you get a sense that the government has a clear-cut definition of what is preventative spend? And if it doesn't have that, how are they actually going to be able to proceed towards the stated objective?
So again, I think that is one which could ask the Scottish Government more about. What is their definition of prevention and how they're going to go about that? I think there's a pertinent element to that, which is that often when you help people now, you're also helping them later. Mm-hmm. So to what extent can you differentiate the immediate help of someone with an obesity issue from how that's going to affect them and their heart in 10 years' time? Yeah. There may be areas which are potentially more clear-cut, where there is a spending now which is for a delayed impact, whether that could be whether that's through sports or through medication or whatever it may be. I think for us, it would be for the Scottish Government to set exactly how their definition would be, but for us it would be, can we see a move towards, or can we see the spending which aligns with the objective of investing in future health? And there's been, I think this is something that we had raised in our reform report last year, and we did see in last year's budget a smaller kind of spend to save programme coming through into the budget lines. So I'd be interested to see, as we move through the coming year, how the Scottish Government is reflecting, reporting and monitoring those spends which may have less of an immediate return and more of a long-term one.
But would you consider it also goes further than the health service? For example, if you cut an employability scheme, then therefore you're dealing with unemployment or skills gaps later. Is Is there more work, do you think, the Scottish Government needs to do, however, to classify it right across the board? Because otherwise, it does strike me that they're problem solving all the time rather than preventing problems developing. And is that just the nature of the short-term stop-go budget gap, I suppose?
I think there's always a benefit in clarity and transparency about what you're trying to achieve with the spending, and I absolutely agree. It's across all hosts of activities. I think traditionally the MPF has been part of that drive to have a more long-term conversation and a monitoring against those kind of long-term goals, which allows you to talk about the short-term spending decisions that have a long-term impact alongside those longer-term ones. We know that the MTFS is under a refresh. I think it's fair for us to expect a kind of continued focus on the impact of spending on long-term decisions.
Yeah.
I would say on measuring prevention and classifying prevention, I think the Scottish Government, I think they're clear that they don't fully have that yet. I think it's helpful that they are looking to develop more of that. And we highlighted that in our submission and our commentary relating to the MTFS. And I think it will be helpful for them to deliver on that and put more detail to it. And it's something that I think everyone recognises that it is probably helpful. We think it is helpful, but quantifying it is very hard. And I think one of the problems with some of the categorization of it within government, really, I think is an example of Goodhart's law. It's like when something becomes a target, then it's easy to have any meaning. So there's an issue of, you know, if you then try to categorize everything on whether it really is preventative or not, are you just encouraging people to put that forward on the preventative lens rather than the curing acute issues lens?
And just finally, you mentioned earlier the misalignment between different strategies and work streams the government undertaking, but you note in your submission that the medium-term financial strategy does not refer to the national performance framework at all. So there's not even a misalignment. There's just no attempt to align the two. The convener, myself and Mr Mara, spoke with the Scottish Government last week about their review of the national performance framework. And I think probably best I took from that meeting is that there was going to be some tinkering of it, but not a fundamental remodelling or reworking of what it does or what it's intended to do. You go on to mention that the 81 national current performance indicators and that no performance data has been reported against 11 of them. So if we are to press ahead with something like the national performance framework, for it to be useful, what would you like to see out of that? And if it's to be a benchmarking exercise, presumably it's just an internal monitoring thing and it should rest with the national statistician. If it's to be a toolkit, then arguably an organisation such as Audit Scotland could have some interface with it or ownership of it to a certain extent. So I suppose just what impression have you got in terms of where the government is going on this? And if it is to be useful and valuable and therefore we should commit further taxpayers' money to it, what would you like it to see emerging at the end of this process?
So I think those words that you used, useful and valuable. So what is the purpose of the MTFS, going back to the brass tacks of it, I suppose? One of it was to enable the Scottish Government to get a consensus around what the long-term goals were, something which it could then map its short-term actions against, something that it could use to prioritise and make informed decisions. And then something it could use to reflect and understand the interactions between different pots of money. Yeah. So we've spoken, in this session around the links between spending on the economy and health and education and skills. So that sense of it still remains. I think we've commented in the section 22 that it was disappointing that some of the measures and indicators that were used to judge that progress still hadn't been collected, and so we'd probably expect to see measures that are being collected, or any outcomes that they have, to have a solid model of accountability and monitoring underneath it with regular collected information, And we'd like to see that linked through to what the spending decisions in the shorter term and the medium term are. So there's a sense of what the direction of travel is over the longer term. And I think, you know, given the documents related to the inquiry in relation to population health and those effects up to 2074, 75, the importance of maintaining that longer term lens alongside those shorter and medium term challenges remains.
Is there a risk with all the different documents that come before us, including your reports? And when I was on public audit, I could sense your frustration when you would come back, you know, time and time again on the health service or major capital projects, and you're identifying the same weaknesses in the system. Is there an issue here that we simply can't see the wood for the trees because there is just too much verbiage going on round about it, and just a more simple approach to how we set goals, monitor them and report back on them and audit them would actually be more useful for this committee, for Parliament and for the public at large?
Again, I think it's one that'd be you know, a pertinent question to put the Scottish Government in terms of how they are going to manage their long-term priorities. And I suppose at risk of repeating myself, that there is the benefit of having a framework for outcomes is the ability to be able to align and converge and marshal your spending and decisions towards what you want to achieve for future generations. So I think that it be interested to see the extent to which the refresh or the review does result in any substantial changes or not. At the heart of it is this something that is being used to monitor and manage the impact of spending decisions and the achievement of priorities that go beyond the medium term.
Super, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank both our witnesses this morning. Is there any further points you feel we haven't touched on that you would like to highlight at this point?
Nothing. There's been quite a wide-ranging coverage. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm now going to call a break until 10:45 to allow a change of witnesses. Thank you very much. on pre-budget scrutiny with a roundtable discussion. I therefore like to welcome to the meeting Michael Kellett, Director of Strategy, Governance and Performance at Public Health Scotland. Is it David Livy? I think we may have met once or twice before. Policy and Public Affairs Manager, Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, SCVO of course. David Moxham, Deputy General Secretary, Scottish Trade Union Congress. Mike Brown, Treasurer Social Work Scotland. And Ian McCall, Policy and Campaigns Officer, Walking Scotland. So welcome you all and thank you for your written submissions. We've around 90 minutes for this session, and if witnesses wish to be brought into discussion at any point, please indicate to the clerks and I'll call you. So it's not going to be a question of me asking each of you questions in turn. I'm just going to start with an opening question, which will be to David Moxham. And we will, don't act surprised, I told you 2 minutes ago I was going to start with you.
What, throw me a boomerang there, Ken? You normally do.
No. So we'll start with a question to David Moxham, and then anyone who wants to comment on what David's saying, just let me know, and we'll just move around the table and we'll cover a number of areas. There are some areas which people have made very strong particular comments on. I'm sure we'll get to those, but if we don't, I can go to someone and say, in your submission you said such and such, and we'll take it from there, but we may not have to go there. OK then, David, so S2C, straight off, and more or less the first paragraph, you say, Scotland needs more workers. While migration and reserve matter, the Scottish Government should be engaging with the UK Government, pushing for the devolution of powers related to migration and employment law. And for Scottish Government involvement in important cross-border institutions and decision-making to ensure Scotland-specific population challenges are heard at a UK level. Now, I think, to be fair, the Scottish Government has tried to do a lot of that. I'm not sure that the UK Government, past and present, are too keen on migration. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about that particular issue first, because it is a very important issue at this current time.
Thanks very much, Convener. I know I've been at this committee before, so this may feel like a bit of a rehearsal, but it seems to me it's very difficult to have a discussion about the relative balance between the economy and public spending levels if we don't acknowledge, I would now say, three key factors. Factor number one, demographic change. I heard you talking about it. Demographic change is with us. It's a Western phenomenon, but it's a very strong phenomenon here, the balance between those we're going to need to care for and therefore the number of people who are going to need to be economically active to fund that. Is a structural future problem. There are ways to mitigate that through efficiency and other issues, but the simple message is we are going to have to pay a higher proportion of our income. I say that generically because there's different ways to approach that in the future than we are now. That's the first one. And the second one is climate change. Again, we touch upon that in our submission. Whatever one's view about the relative balance of the private and the public sector in meeting the challenge of climate change, it is unthinkable that government will not have to be more directive, more interventionist, and more supportive in doing so. That comes at a cost. And frankly, the third one I'd add now, irrespective of one's view on the best way to sort it, is that we have highly difficult international conditions, things that are seeing obviously to increases in government spending across the world on arms and munitions, and that comes at a cost. So the first thing to say is simply this: we are going to have to pay more tax. The alternatives or the partner pieces of that are growing the economy, but growing the economy, which can be done to some extent by the active labour market policies to ensure we have more people who are currently here working, will have to be married with increased migration. I accept, as you said, Convener, that that's not a popular thing to say now, but just because it's not popular doesn't mean that it's not true. So our economy will only increase to the level that it requires to do with some degree of migration aligned to other strategies, and there is no way in a decade's time that we can be paying less as a proportion of our income in tax unless we want to see the decimation of public services and welfare provision in Scotland.
For that, David. Craig, to be followed by John.
Good morning, Mr Moxham. Just to perhaps just discuss how Scottish trade unions enter into discussions with the Scottish Government around pay negotiations. You'll be aware that the government have set public sector pay target of 9% over the coming...
Or like that, or the taxation things that John...
No, I was going to
David
come on
said.
public sector pay. If you
Right, okay, fine.
So just in relation to that 9% pay, you'll be well aware from ministers that the Scottish Government has a fixed budget, and therefore their capacity to borrow or to fund public sector pay effectively comes out of other public services. So as we're giving consideration to the Scottish budget, when we speak to the Finance Secretary, in previous years she said that she didn't want to put a public sector pay policy out because that became the flow through which public sector pay negotiations were conducted. Amongst your members, what is their mood at the moment looking forward in relation to public sector pay specifically, given that we now have a 9% policy over the next 3 years, which could be subject to change, but that is the policy at this point in time. Is there an awareness that there will be cuts to frontline services if your members, particularly public sector unions, continue to press for pay settlements that are above that 9%, which is where they're tracking at the moment?
Okay, we'll let David respond.
Yeah. I mean, there's an awareness that the government has choices, and those choices include a whole range of measures, including reviewing its relationship with business and how much it pays to business. There's an awareness that it has tax-raising options, and therefore we're one of the few organisations, I would argue, that will come and sit here and say that we don't have any suggestions about how public pay should be financed. We do. We recognise it's a difficult situation. Government has difficult choices, but we continue to have a public sector workforce who, we argue, does a very good job, deserves to be better remunerated and deserves pay restoration, and we will continue to campaign for that. Now, negotiations are negotiations, and each one of those will be undertaken by the unions concerned, but I kind of like be losing my reputation if I was going to say, yeah, great, mate, we'll settle for less. We will, we will argue about the value of public sector workers, the value of them to society, and the need to fund decent pay rises for us, and that's not going to change.
Okay, John, to be followed by Ross.
Thanks, Convener. I agree with Dave with a lot of what you say about immigration and tax and that side of things. Now, we hear quite a lot here about words like efficiency and productivity, and I just wonder, do you think there's a lot of room for improved efficiency and improved productivity, and how do we do any of that?
Yeah, I'll just say one overarching thing, if I can. I know that a lot of the discourse that you've had is predicated on this. I'm not saying people take this view or would use this language, a kind of bloated public sector in Scotland. And we've seen comparative figures in terms of the percentage workforce here compared to down south. We've got to be really careful. I'm not saying we're comparing apples with oranges, but we might be comparing oranges with satsumas here, right, in the sense that there are significant differences in the way the public services are delivered down south. There's a bigger private element in care, there's a bigger private element in school education, and there's a bigger private element in social care as well as health. So we've got to be quite careful when we look at these overall figures that we may be being insufficiently granular at looking at those percentages. I mean, schools is a great example. I think it's about 3% of Scottish children are educated privately. That jumps to 7% in England. Social care, even larger differential. So we've got to be quite careful when we look at these top-line figures and assume that there's something about efficiency in there. Are we open to efficiency discussions? Yes, absolutely. The problem is, and this is not my first rodeo when it comes to public sector reform, is that it tends to happen, or the discussion tends to start too late. It happens when we have a problem, and therefore a lot of the process of that is led by targeted cuts rather than proper discussions about what public sector reform might look like. The Fire Service and the FBU have had a joint proposal on the table since 2022, which is investment-led, but is, by common consent, a really great blueprint shared by employer and workers on how they can become more effective and more efficient over a decade and into the future. The problem was nothing was done about that in 2022, and we're now in 2025 using tap-led approaches to public service reform. But we will have that discussion. Of course we have to have that discussion. The Scottish workers aren't going to sit by while people discuss their future without them having some input, and where, through digitisation and other efficiencies that can take place, particularly if it can free up frontline workers to deliver the service that needs to be done, we'll have that discussion. It's our duty to. And actually, very often it's the workers themselves, if you ask them, who have the best solutions to the reform that needs to be undertaken.
I am going to bring in Ross next, but I'll say to our guests, if you don't start asking questions yourselves, I'm just going to start picking on you. So, Ross.
Thanks very much. I'll ask Dave a question, but then try and open up to everybody else. Just picking up on points you're making, in particular about tax. The STUC has consistently come with proposals to raise revenue, which is helpful very often in pre-budget scrutiny. Everybody comes to make a pitch for why there needs to be more spending in their area. So it's helpful to hear that. But I'm interested if you believe that the fiscal gap that we've got can be made up entirely through the revenue-raising options that you've put forward in your papers recently, bearing in mind in particular that a lot of the more substantive reforms you're talking about would take, if they were agreed, would take 3, 4, 5 years. So council tax revaluations, probably a minimum of 3 years. Some of this stuff would require new primary legislation. And if you don't think that it could all be done through additional revenue raising, are there any particularly obvious areas of savings? It feels like your paper kind of hinted at that in some areas, but it'd be useful to draw that out. And if we could broaden it out to everybody else, it would be helpful to hear if everybody has even just one example of an area in which the government could be making particularly obvious savings on its current spend, areas of low value spend that could be redeployed elsewhere, for example, but at a reduced cost.
Yeah, the short answer to the first part of that question is no. As you rightly say, we're talking about 3, 4, 5 year horizons for what we think is the necessary rebalancing of taxation between property and assets and wages, and that's partly a recognition that government is limited in what it can do with income-related. We think there's more they can do, but it's limited with what it can do with income-related tax change because of border effects. So the short answer to that is no. We think there are some things that can be done. The second answer, I'll just be indicative, and I know I always say this, and I get very little support, very little obvious support from committee members. We are spending a significant amount of money on the small business bonus scheme. I don't think there's anything wrong with providing targeted assistance to small businesses, particularly when it's linked to fair work and growth. There has been absolutely no evidence that the now, I want to say several £billion cumulatively that has been spent on that has actually helped. What it is really, and I accept the value of this, is it's almost a welfare payment to some struggling businesses, and that's important, and I think we need to look at how we would support them. But, for many people who support, who oppose universality in many other areas would find it very difficult to support a universal payment to businesses, irrespective of how well they do, irrespective of their business structure, based on, very insensitive kind of criteria. So I'd have a look at that. I wouldn't say I'd get rid of it. I'd certainly make it better. And that would save a good couple of £100 million in my view.
Just before I let David in, actually, David Livy and Dave, I'm just going to ask you, in your paper, and this was touched on in questions there, said reform should also be accompanied with upfront investment to enable change to happen with associated savings achieved further down the line. And Ross was asking if there's any examples. So if there are any examples in an area where you think that could actually transpire and make significant savings.
Sorry, just to clarify, on public service efficiency?
Yeah, reforms, yeah.
Frankly, almost everywhere. I came ready with my most detailed answer, and that was the Fire and Rescue Service, because it's been on the table for 3 years. So I'll stick with that one, because that's the one I came prepared with, but I'm quite happy to send in a couple of other examples if you
Okay, that'd be helpful, unless you want to mention any of them just now, no?
No. Okay. No, I mean, just to be clear, what that requires is, in my view at least, is a fairly detailed understanding of what's on the table in various areas, and I'm sure many of my unions would have that expertise, but I don't want to jump in and say spend £100 million in health doing X without the kind of stats and information behind.
Okay, thank you. David?
Thanks, Convener. So it's just really to come in on Ross's question and your own question, Convener, about it's not necessarily a cut or a saving, but it's doing things smarter. And we think that two policy reforms in particular could make a big difference to voluntary sector delivery of public services, which is a big thing. Voluntary organisations deliver public services across the country. That shouldn't be lost in the conversation. Receives about £1 billion from the Scottish Government to do that, £1.6 billion from local authorities to do that in 2023 stats. This is across a whole host of issues. They're not incidental to people's lives, they're core. It's things like employability, care for loved ones, community transport, mental health support. It could go on. But, and we've been talking about this for a long time, for anyone who's not the first rodeo on public service reform, a big thing is fair funding and funding for the sector. The public funding landscape for the voluntary sector right now it can be pretty inefficient. Things like late payment to voluntary organisations, payments that don't increase in line with inflation, funding of only a year, so organisations are having to apply for funding year on to do the same piece of work. That needs fixed. I know the Scottish Government is doing work on this. There's a sort of patchwork of pilots just now on fair funding and multi-year funding models that we'll be very keen to see what the outcomes of that are. But this is obviously something we've been talking about for a long time. I think this is a thing in the public service reform strategy that is named. I think from memory, static funding is how it's referred to as being an issue for the sector. That needs addressed. We've done a lot of work with the voluntary sector over the years in terms of what that could look like. It's called fair funding for anyone who's interested and not familiar. So that's one big reform. Another big reform is basically cracking the partnership between the voluntary organisation and public sector. So there are different models that exist across the UK. So the UK government's just introduced their covenant framework. Northern Ireland have just refreshed their partnership with the voluntary sector in June of this year. In Wales, this has been in with the BRICS since the inception of devolution with the third sector scheme. But in Scotland, we don't really have anything. And I think the sector needs a new formalised partnership with public services. So there needs to be a bit of work done on that. We've done some work with the sector ahead of next year's elections, which we won't talk about too much. But that's the sector would like to see something formal, set in statute, outcomes focused, and that's protective of the sector's independence. So those two things, fair funding and cracking collaboration, I think are tremendously important.
Okay, just before I let Liz in, I was going to ask, I mean, obviously multi-year funding is an issue, which the Scottish Government for years has said, well, there's no multi-year funding from the UK. Now we've got a spending review. Do you think this is an opportunity to bring in multi-year funding for the third sector? And also, in terms of your submission, you talk about increased employer national insurance contribution costs. Now, my understanding is the Scottish Government got about £339 million towards that, but the actual impact on the public sector and third sector is about 700 million. So given the fact that the Scottish Government hasn't effectively received additional funding to compensate for that, how can they then pass that on without having to take money from their own projects and programmes?
So I'll come to the multi-year funding first. We think the multi-year spending outlook for the Scottish Government is useful, so yes. Multi-year funding is a thing, has been a thing. So we don't see any significant impediment to providing voluntary organisations delivering public services with that surety. So yes, to answer that question. Okay. In terms of national insurance, you're quite right. We opposed the Chancellor's increased employer national insurance contributions at the time. In fact, because it was such a well-trailed budget in advance of it being announced, we wrote to the Chancellor in advance saying, don't do this. This is going to be a problem for voluntary organisations. I think it costs voluntary organisations about 75 million a year, is what we've calculated. Some do pay less, but those organisations that employ 5 people or more, they're paying more. So that absolutely is a problem. But it is the new cost of doing business. So in line with our fair funding asks to make sure that grants and contracts coming from the Scottish Government basically reflect the cost of delivery, we'd like to see the Scottish Government in its own contracts and grants meeting that cost of delivery.
Okay, thank you for that. Liz, to be followed by Mike.
David, can I just ask you about the fair funding aspect? I was with a voluntary group in my own constituency area on Friday, and they were arguing very strongly that when it comes to getting funding, it's easier to get what they called project funding for a specific project, but very much more difficult to get core funding to support their, their whole wherewithal, and therefore that threatens their ability to be sustainable and their long-term future. Is that something that the voluntary sector is really concerned about across the board?
Yeah, that's one component, so that is a problem. So there are a number of different strands to our fair funding asks. One of them is flexible funding, and that's that funding through grants and contracts can be used flexibly and unrestricted funding, essentially. A problem we're seeing just now is voluntary organisations are increasingly having to dip into the reserves to basically meet the cost of delivery day to day. That's a massive problem for an organisation's sustainability.
Yep.
I mean, worst comes to worst, reserves are there for winding up, paying redundancies, these kind of things. So it is a massive problem, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, there's too many Michaels and Mikes here. Mike, to be followed by Michael Kellett.
Yeah, I just wanted to return to the question of how to grow the workforce. I mean, I think migration is a problem, particularly for the UK government, and it's one because it's become a sort of symbol for many people of sort of deeper issues which have been around, really growing since the financial crash in 2008 to 10. But so it will be difficult, I think, for Scotland to develop its own migration policies. That's will be felt particularly in areas like social care and nursing, which have traditionally relied on quite a lot of incoming labour. The other area which is around at the moment is what to do about the increasing numbers of people, younger people, of working age who are unable to work for a range of reasons, increasing mental health problems, physical disabilities. I don't think we've quite got to the bottom of all those causes, although it has been exacerbated by COVID. But clearly there needs to be a big invest to save programme around the support workforce employability for people on those disability benefits. For many of those people, there won't be a quick fix. Their problems are often quite complicated in my experience. But we do need to actually plan that out and across the third sector and also local government and the health service in particular. So I think that is one of the major areas for Invest to Save.
Okay. Now, one of the things I found interesting in your submission was the fact that your Social Work Scotland I've talked about Barnett formula basically, and you're effectively suggesting that that it doesn't take into account Scotland's comparative load of population, lower healthy life expectancy, or wider deprivation inequalities, all of which are drivers for higher NHS spend in Scotland.
Yes, I mean that was a kind of perhaps a slightly casual stray into a really complicated area. But the Barnett formula doesn't do that. As you know, it's per head of total population is Scotland's share of the relevant comparator, whether that's England or England and Wales or with Northern Ireland. Obviously, that was designed actually to reduce over time Scotland's higher public expenditure per head, and there's a whole research literature on why that hasn't happened to any degree, and it was a temporary move during the Callaghan government. So it goes back quite a long way. Now, reopening that, I think, would be a bit of a can of worms and could result, of course, in Scotland actually having less than it currently has out of that formula, because we'd have to look at our ageing population, which is ageing faster than England, certainly, but also about our looking at our relative poverty compared to other parts of the UK. So it was really, I suppose, a comment as an aside. I wasn't really recommending that we reopen Barnet unless we do a lot of preparatory work about what the implications of that would be.
I wondered, because I don't think Wales would be too chuffed apart from anything else. But Michael Kelly.
Thanks, Convener. Really grateful for the opportunity to give evidence today, and I'll take up your invitation and Ross Greer's, Convener, if that's all right. The first thing to say is I won't be making a pitch for more funding for health and social care in Scotland, and that's not just because Public Health Scotland, as a part of the NHS and a national board, is selfless, but it's because we know that 80% of what makes for good health is not around health and social care services. That's about the social determinants of health, it's about the environment that we live in, it's about how we approach healthy behaviours as well. My pitch today, and it echoes what I said at this time last year, Convener, is around thinking around how we embed preventative spend more closely across our budgeting, right across the public sector in Scotland. When I was here last year, I talked about the DEMOS proposal around a separate category of preventative spend to sit alongside revenue and capital, and while that didn't happen, it is encouraging from our perspective that Scottish Government is now considering how to track prevention spend as part of its public sector reform strategy, and Workscene 6 of the public sector reform strategy sets that out. That's also echoed in the population health framework, which we were instrumental in supporting Government and COSLA to develop, and will work with them on the implementation. We're also, Convener, if it's interesting, the committee working with NHS colleagues around how we track, identify and therefore throw a light on preventative spend within the NHS, which should then allow us to take informed decisions about protecting that spend. So that would be my key ask for the committee today, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll resist the temptation to put my own tuppence worth in, because I now have 5 people who want to come in, and I'm sure a lot of them want to speak about preventive spend. So I'll have Michael, Mara, followed by Ian.
Yeah, thanks. It's on the point you've just made, Michael, in terms of the relationship between the core health spend, whereas I understand that you're saying that it doesn't all go in one direction. Surely, if there's a cut, for instance, the Financial Sustainable Delivery Plan proposes a 3% annualised cut to health boards, that there will be an impact on private and public health if that is put in place. I mean, do you have any clarity as an organisation on what that 3% means, how it will be driven through, whether it would impact on your own activities?
Yeah, so the 3% from my perspective, and I wear a number of hats in Public Health Scotland. I'm not a finance professional, but I wear effectively the Director of Finance hat. For us in Public Health Scotland, and my understanding, it's the same for other health boards, that 3% is cash release and efficiency savings, and that's around identifying efficiency savings that are kept in the organisation to be reinvested in other work. Now, that is a challenge for us to achieve, given the nature of our organisation. We spend a huge percentage of our spend on staffing costs, and therefore making those efficiencies is challenging. I know that's a challenge for other NHS boards as well. But you're right, one of the things we are concerned about, and I know Director of Finance colleagues right across the NHS are concerned about, is that when things are really constrained financially, then some of that investment upstream in preventative efforts is the one that sometimes can be the most attractive to reduce, and that is a real worry for us, which is why that clarity around what is preventative spend, shining a light on it, tracking it over time, that we think is so important.
Okay. Thank you. Ian, to follow by John.
It was really just following up on what Michael's been talking about. We responded to this consultation because it seemed like an opportunity to support the kind of movement towards preventative spend. I mean, we've been talking about preventative spend, seems like for decades. I mean, Christie Commission was 2011, I think. But I kind of get the feeling now that we're in a position where it's more possible that we might start achieving some of that with things like the physical activity and health framework, which takes a systems-based approach, because a lot of, I mean, physical activity, getting people more active longer, is one of the biggest wins in public health, I think, and walking, our narrow area of interest is walking and wheeling, but that's one of the easiest ways of getting people more physically active. But as I say, I think the frameworks that we're getting in place offer an opportunity to maybe be a bit more joined up in spending. So, for example, what helps people be more physically active, or it's the environment they live in, it's the interventions of various sorts, but it cuts across lots of different policy areas, and I think it's a question of being more kind of joined up in how we approach these things. Yes, I suppose that in terms of walking in particular, it's one of the easiest ways to get people physically active, particularly people in low incomes. You don't need no special equipment to do it. It's one of these things that it's an activity you can continue into later life when changing demographic. I think getting very inactive people more active and enabling them to stay active longer is crucial, really. I've got an aged aunt who recently fell and fractured her hip. She's been very active all her life. She's 93 and she's back walking about now. So she's a great advert for walking the walk, as it were. So thank you. So.
Yeah, I have to say, actually, I'm obsessed with the number of steps I do in a day, and I have to say the thing about walking is we can talk about all the preventive measures we like, but walking costs nothing and delivers phenomenal health benefits for so many people. I mean, and it does, as you've outlined in some detail in your paper, that's one I don't think we'll have any issue with. I mean, one of the issues we do have with preventive spend, and I'm pretty sure John will talk about that when he comes in next, is about disinvestment in order to fund investment in preventive care. That's always been an issue. Anyway, I won't put words in your mouth, John, but it's you.
I just told me what I was to ask. What question I was to ask. Well, I was going to ask something to Mike, but seeing Ian McCall just spoken, is there a danger, or is it inevitable, that when you advertise walking and all that, you engage with the people who are already a bit active and they get more active, so that's good, but actually the people who are doing very little, and you specifically mentioned deprived areas, can you engage with them, or does the gap just get wider and wider? That's was my second question. My main question, Mike Brown, following on from what you'd been saying, I was interested in part of your contribution in writing, reflecting on our members' recent experience improving productivity of social work services through the adoption of technology. We've been struck by how many practical and cultural barriers exist, slowing development and implementation. And then also a bit about highly risk-adverse attitudes towards sharing personal data. I just wondered if you could maybe expand on that bit.
I can't actually personally. That we have a member of staff who is running a digital programme with social workers, that paragraph is provided by him. What I can do is go back and ask for more information. I mean, it's work which is at quite an early stage and does use a particular piece of software which you have to purchase to provide notes of meetings and including ones which aren't through Microsoft Teams, which is a restriction on another product which is in wide use. I'm sorry if I'm saying I'm hedging it. I don't want to.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
Particular.
I mean, I just wondered if the very word.
So there are a lot of savings in terms of social workers' time. Mm-hmm. I mean, 8 hours a week has been mentioned in work he's been doing. So, which is a lot, because one of the concerns that social workers have is the large admin overhead which is involved, and necessarily so because they need to have the records of what they're doing and the planning with the person for what outcomes they want, etc. on computer systems, so they can be tracked properly.
I just wondered is your sector happy to talk about productivity? Because I sometimes get the impression that when I speak to teachers or speak to health workers, they're a bit uncomfortable talking about productivity.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think our sector is up in degree, like most sectors. I mean, we're very interested in using new technology of the kind of just we've been talking about, but at the same time, social workers' caseloads have really got much heavier in volume terms and in complexity terms, really over the last period, over the period of austerity, essentially, last 10, 12, 15 years. And they feel they're in a service which is in crisis. I mean, there's also a lot of recruitment and retention issues, as there is for social care. So, the latest Public Health Scotland statistics on people waiting for an assessment, which is normally often done by social workers, or for a care at home package. If you add those figures up, it's currently 10,700 as of August. So I mean, there are a lot of pressures in the sector, and that can turn people away from what can seem to them to be glib talk about productivity, when actually there isn't time in the working week, with a lot of unpaid overtime done actually by social workers to deliver a service that they are committed to. So with those caveats, yes, the sector is up for further discussions.
Okay, Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you. Mr. Keller, I liked your appeal at the beginning that you said you weren't necessarily looking for any additional money, which is probably quite reassuring.
Craig's kind of guy.
The government at this point in time. Two questions, both quite different. In relation to preventative spending, we asked Audit Scotland earlier, do they have a better definition of it, and could you get a categorisation that you could bake into a budget that therefore became ring-fenced? Is there any international best practice around this that you could learn from and the government could learn from? Because it still strikes me that it's quite nebulous.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. So there is work. We've done work in Public Health Scotland, which is reflected in the Population Health Framework, so page 13 of the Population Health Framework that was published by Government and COSLA just before the summer, sets out a definition of primary prevention, secondary prevention and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention, it's about investing in the building blocks, stopping people falling into the proverbial river in the first place. Secondary prevention, about focusing on early detection, supporting early intervention and treatment to reduce harm. And then tertiary prevention is about how you care for somebody when they're in the whole kind of person sense, once they're kind of needing health or social care. That's our definition. We've been doing work with SIPVA, who are really interested in supporting the thinking that's happening in Scotland and UK-wide around this idea of kind of identifying preventative spend. They are working with a number of local authorities in Scotland and elsewhere to progress that. I understand that in terms of work stream 6 of the public sector reform strategy I talked about earlier, government colleagues, including economists, are thinking about that too. So it feels like there's movement there. I don't pretend it's easy. I think the DEMOS kind of proposal a year ago made clear that defining prevention is going to be really important, because you could game the system. If everything can be defined as prevention, then how do you really ensure you're protecting what's really prevention over time? So I think it is a good question. It is a difficult issue, but I think not just in Public Health Scotland, but with across government and public finance professionals, there's active work to make a workable definition that I think would be really helpful.
I was trying to find the evidence session where this evidence was given to the committee before, but we had, perhaps the convener remember who gave this evidence, but we had somebody before us who said that one of the tensions in the NHS is the strive for more people, more surgeons, more doctors, more nurses, and that actually you need to look at, the analogy they used was putting more chefs in a kitchen that has no better equipment or isn't bigger will not necessarily lead to more throughput. So is there a tension that the government, and it's all of our faults to a certain extent, press for more clinicians, etc., and therefore, in order to get towards a real preventative spend, we need to change the narrative with the public, which is actually the old ways of doing things won't necessarily deliver. Now, we need to bring down orthopaedic waiting lists, for example, so we do need to focus on that. But is there this trade-off, and at the moment, is preventative spend losing the argument?
I mean, I'm not a spokesman for the government, clearly, but I would say that the service renewal framework that was published alongside the population health framework about the NHS and social care made really clear that those can't be in opposition, that emphasis on prevention is really important. And the NHS does a huge amount of work on prevention. Our work on vaccines and Public Health Scotland with local boards is just one example of that. But also the public has a right to achieve reasonable weights as well. So one of the challenges for the NHS, and I see territorial board colleagues wrestling with this day and daily, is about how you deliver on those challenges around reducing long waits in particular, but also protect the investment upstream in preventative measures. And that's really challenging. I suppose our approach is that if we were able to clearly identify and track preventative expenditure, that would help decision makers in government and in local boards as well to get that balance right.
Yeah. Attention.
Okay, I'm going to come in myself actually, but I want to let the three people who we've got already listed here to speak before I come in again myself. Michelle, to follow by Mike.
First question is just following up this discussion about preventative spend. The tendency of any organisation or government is always to want to spend money. That's a kind of flat state. So I just wondered from your perspective, Michael, what kind of consideration had been given to creating a culture where personal responsibility can also be actively considered as a part of it, whilst recognising the very real challenges when we're looking at some health issues. And also a general kind of question for everybody here. The discussion today, we've had quite a kind of, it feels like quite a shift where we're prepared more now to think the unthinkable. We had a discussion earlier about universality, and you've made comments, Dave, about the Scottish business bonus arguably propping up, in effect, zombie businesses. But then that brings me to a challenge to yourself, David. Have we got exactly the same thinking where, in effect, we're propping up zombie volunteer organisations who aren't focusing fundamentally on their own financial resilience, and it's not necessarily their fault, it's just over time, that comment about it's easier to go for the low-hanging fruit in terms of project funding. So the general question is, have we entered a stage where people, for the first time, arguably subject to the politics and whatnot, are prepared to think a bit differently across our whole public sector?
Yes,
I'll pick up, if that's all right, on the first element of the question around personal responsibility. It's a really important issue, and it's a tricky issue to get the balance right, and it's something we think hard about in Public Health Scotland. Of course, we want to equip individuals to make good choices about their health, but we need to recognise, and this goes back to the point about social determinants of health, around the impact of the environment. So one of the two priorities, as the committee will know, in the population health framework is around diet and healthy weight. And the evidence is really clear that what affects how people eat, how many calories they consume, is the food environment in which they live. How easily accessed, how affordable is healthy food. What happens when you go into a supermarket and are faced with discounts on chocolate and things that don't improve your health. So one of the things we would say in Public Health Scotland is we need to think really hard about that food environment, and if we get the balance wrong and send the message that it's individuals' fault if they're struggling in that environment, that would be a retrograde step. So it is a tricky issue, but one we think the population health framework gets right about recognising the importance of that environmental factors.
Okay, Mike, to be followed by Ian.
So yes, in talking about prevention, I think there's two things I'd like to say. The first, in terms of health and social care, I mean, one of the biggest reservoirs of prevention really is all the unpaid caring work that is done in Scotland. I mean, they are the largest workforce, actually, if you want to regard them in that way. And I think there's growing concern about whether the unpaid carers get sufficient support. If you look at the Public Health Scotland, it's the Scottish Government's health and care experience statistics, you'll see that the time series shows that carers' satisfaction with their life care balance, with their health, their everything, what support they get, it's about half a dozen measures. On all measures, those have been really going down each year on each 2 year survey, survey every 2 years. There's just been a slight uptick recently, which is really, I think, because unpaid carers' perceptions have changed, because they were really, now we're coming out of the COVID situation, things are a bit better than the rock bottom they hit during COVID. So I think that's a matter of concern. Now, of course, we've got the Care Reform Act now and the right to a break for carers. That's a right to have an assessed unmet need met by the duty bearer, which is the local authority, without further eligibility criteria. So,
this week has just actually extended the carers allowance for young carers to 19 to 520 pounds.
No, I think they're doing well on. I think they're doing well on the payment side. The carers allowance and the social security. I'm more concerned about the what support is available to carers, but particularly in the community. Now, one of the things I was going to say is that the funding which will be made available over a 10-year period, probably from next year, to implement the relevant bit in the Act, the Care Reform Act. What's needed, I think, initially is a pivot towards the infrastructure required for carers. Are there enough carers centres? Can people access them? There's whole areas of Scotland without access to local care centres. These tend to be third sector organisations. So I think there needs to be an infrastructure investment in facilities support to support carers having a break, etc. And that's not reflected in the what was actually the third financial memorandum on this issue, which was published in a letter to you in May. So I think there's still work needs to be done to rebalance some of the support which is coming for carers. And also, the reason I started talking about assessment is because that's one of the areas without any additional funding in that final finance memorandum. So there are defects in the funding being planned for carers, which is essential, really, I think, to maintain and perhaps increase the volume of care provided by unpaid carers, who are the people providing the most volume of care in Scotland.
Okay, Ian, to be followed by David.
Thank you. John asked a question about whether there was a risk in increasing inequalities in relation to physical activity. I think that's a good question. I think we know that more affluent people tend to be more physically active, and we know that the people who would benefit most from getting more active are probably the people least likely to access the opportunities. So I think, yes, we have to be very careful in targeting the individuals and communities that we're intervening with or helping. So and be mindful when we're planning projects that we address that issue, yes. So.
Okay, David?
Yeah, it's just to come back on Michelle Thompson's question. So obviously, a voluntary organisation, sustainability is its own responsibility. It should have a good reserves policy and such. Recently, there's been pretty significant financial challenges facing the voluntary sector. That's something that's been picked up through our own research, through the tracker, it's called. Financial challenges are the biggest issues facing the voluntary sector. So it is a challenging time. I suppose what we're asking with public funding is that funders don't make things worse. There's a whole litany of examples. I would commend the Social Justice, Social Security's report into third sector funding principles that was published last year as part of the pre-budget scrutiny. It has a whole host of evidence of bad practice making things worse. There was one example which is included in the collection of evidence of an organisation having to deliver an entire year's worth of work, a programme, in 2 months because of poor funding practice. So that's where we're coming at from the fair funding perspective. I suppose It's obviously Scottish Government public bodies' choice which voluntary organisations they choose to fund in terms of which interventions they choose to fund. I think a thing that the sector would welcome is a real outcomes-focused and to come back to my original point on collaboration, working with voluntary organisations to tap into that expertise and that know-how and that reach and that trust in communities to build services that really work. But that does, to come back to Craig Colley's point, it does require a bit of a mindset shift in terms of trust and to come back to the prevention point, that does take a bit of risk taking within public sector funding, but also public sector, because there's a range of preventative measures and interventions that the voluntary sector does that we know work, that have been independently evaluated, that are with less risk, and some of them have been cited within my research, my submission, just as examples. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael Mara wants to come in. David?
We would all recognise that the external funding situation has been volatile globally for a long period of time now. But I think what both the UK government and we're told the Scottish government are trying to do through the spending review processes is to try and add some form of stability for the medium term for organisations through that. So could you tell us what's SCVO's involvement in the spending review process been? Have you been brought into conversations about that process, what you will see as the likely outcomes of it?
So our engagement is primarily with the third sector unit within the Scottish Government, and aside from that we lobby the Scottish Government ahead of fiscal events like medium-term financial strategy, spending review, but not to my awareness brought in directly by Exchequer within government or the like.
So it's no real sight of the process in terms of, because you're a key partner in terms of the delivery of some of those services and some form of stability, which you're asking for around that. I mean, it strikes me that if it doesn't happen, if multi-year funding doesn't happen now in this spending review, then you could say under this government it will never happen. I mean, this is the period that they've got the foresight in terms of the 3 years across the UK government funding. We're told that should be stable, and events, and all that, and that comes with it. But this is surely the opportunity.
That's something that we would definitely like to see come out of the spending review. It's something that we hope we would see in the medium-term financial strategy, but didn't. Obviously, as I've said already, there's a sort of patchwork of pilots that the Scottish Government's doing in terms of their fairer funding work, but not anything more systemic longer term, but that's definitely something that we would like to see and be involved in.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to Craig and Mike are going to come in a minute or two, but I to Michael Kellett, I was just going to ask about go back to preventative spend. Now in 11 to 16 Parliament, John Swinney, first 3 years of that Parliament, had £500 million available to embed preventative spend, and the issue then was that there was resistance, particularly from the NHS, about disinvesting in some projects or some areas that weren't as effective as others in order to invest in preventive spend. And I think the kind of momentum was lost subsequent to that. I have to say, though, is it Public Health Scotland's view that if you actually do invest in prevention, now it will reduce demand, and therefore disinvestment is perhaps not as necessary as one might think, because if you invest successfully, so Craig Hoy raised the issue of Montjara, and it reduces the number of people who need hip operations 5 years from now, or heart attacks or strokes, whatever, then inevitably you will get those savings, and so disinvestment is perhaps not as essential as we maybe thought previously. What's your view on that?
So, and I wasn't around in the period we talked about, Mr. I was elsewhere working in government at that stage, convener. But I think your point, and it builds on what the Scottish Fiscal Commission have told us around the various scenarios. And if we can improve the health of the population, we know that's good for the health of the population, but we also know it's good for the economy and for fiscal sustainability. So absolutely, that is really important. Would I go as far as to saying that means that consideration of disinvestment isn't important? I think it's always imperative on any public services, including the NHS, to think hard about what return we get for that investment. And one of the challenges I think we face is, and I'm thinking about the inverse care law, because many economists would say that if you look at the pattern of health spending, it doesn't match need. In fact, it's the flip of that, and much of the investment goes in areas where there isn't great need. One of the things I should have said earlier, particularly in response to Michelle Thompson's question, is health inequalities is a huge preoccupation for us in Public Health Scotland, and shrinking those health inequalities. We know of late health inequalities have increased, not decreased, and that is a real concern for us. So that does mean, I think, from our perspective, we need to think hard around that debate you had earlier, convener, around kind of universalism against targeted services, and do we need to think through some of those issues very carefully in order to better support those who most need it. And that goes for health services, but other services as well. That point about I made earlier about the social determinants of health. So I'm not sure, hopefully that's a vaguely coherent answer to your question, but I do think the point about recognising improved health is really vital in itself, but also to the sustainability and the fiscal health of the nation is really important.
I think all your answers have been very good and very coherent, I have to say. But one of the things I want to talk about is about the issue you touched on, about the issue you have in the health services. Demand always exceeds supply in terms of resources and people and money, of course. And there's a lot of arguments about, for example, should someone get a £50,000 cancer-busting drug that might only give them a year of life and 3 months of quality life, as opposed to spending that money, for example, on giving, 10 operations or COPDs, whatever, coronary artery bypass grafts, whatever it happens to be in the NHS, just very simple, straightforward measures. So how is Public Health Scotland working to try and address that? Because obviously these things are very emotional. If you've got a relative who does have something like a cancer and there's a drug that can give them an extra year life, to you that's all important. But from an NHS point of view, you've got to look at other potential considerations.
Yeah, absolutely, convener. I mean, one of the ways we do that in Public Health Scotland, as the committee knows, we are the holder of the data on the performance of the health and increasingly now social care system as well as about the health of the population. So we work actively with local boards so they understand their data, can help them make some of those decisions. But your point around how do you make decisions around investing in an expensive cancer drug compared to investing upstream in, say, a children's centre, these are really difficult decisions. I worked previously in government, convener, where we looked at, worked alongside the Scottish Medicine Consortium, and we thought about QALYs, which are our means of trying to, from an economic perspective, kind of identify return on investment in terms of how many healthy years do you get for a particular health investment. But that's a very difficult thing to apply in a prevention space. So I suppose those are really difficult decisions that ministers and local boards will need to make decisions about. Our particular role there in Public Health Scotland is supporting them around gathering and understanding and interpreting the data.
Thank you for that. Craig, to be followed by Mike.
Thank you, convener. David, just in respect of the financial pressures that the many voluntary organisations are feeling, one of the things when I was a councillor, when I used to look closely at funding applications, was how voluntary organisations, as Ms Smith referred to, found it difficult to pay for staff to keep the lights on premises. Are those pressures making those issues as worse? And are you finding something that I noticed when I was looking at those applications, that the pay gap between those who are basically fulfilling in many senses what should be public services through the voluntary sector, who seem to be being paid significantly less if they were operating, for example, for a local authority, working for a local authority? Are you seeing those pay gaps extending and widening? And to go back to the point about preventative spending, in many respects, if the voluntary sector cannot fulfil those vitally important services that they provide, it's going to roll back on the state to do so, I assume, considerably higher costs. So just in relation to pay and conditions within the sector, are you noticing any deterioration? And how aware do you think government is, centrally and local, that if we lose those voluntary organisations, the actual upstream costs down the line will be much, much more significant?
Thanks. So just to start with pay, in terms of how the sector compares with other sectors, private sector, the public sector. So if you look at median hourly pay in the latest ONS ASH stats, the voluntary sector lags behind the public sector in terms of pay. It's slightly ahead of the private sector, but that changes if you look at mean measures, if you look at rather than hourly pay, you look at annual pay, that kind of thing. But I won't spend too much time on that. But there is a lag between the voluntary sector and the public sector. In terms of that being an issue for those voluntary organisations that are delivering public services, yes, we agree. Part of our fair funding asks are to make sure that contracts and grants that come to the voluntary sector do allow them to pay well, to retain staff, to recruit staff. Because sub-inflationary contracts are, a real problem for staff morale, for recruitment, for retention, and ultimately, you're correct, that does knock on to delivery of services as well. So, yes, we would like to see contracts and grants coming to the sector basically fair work proofed, so that the voluntary sector can deliver that.
Yes, the other point I wanted to make about prevention is around spend to save. I mean, for the first time in recent years, anyway, the Scottish budget last year included a spend to save fund, but it was only set at 30 million, which, if that was for a smaller council, that might make a difference. But it's for the whole of the public sector in Scotland. I mean, I think the size of that really has to be upscaled, dramatically, because major disinvestment is not going to be possible for a lot of services because they are actually needed by the people who use them, and that's the lack of double running costs has been, I think, one of the major obstacles to making more progress with prevention. So, if we had a larger spend to save fund and also some infrastructure around people and research to, I mean, maybe some of this is already in Public Health Scotland, but it isn't around the public sector more generally. I mean, for example, the Scottish Government recently published quite a useful piece of research called Learning from 25 Years of Preventative Interventions in Scotland, but that only covered 15 programmes. And what's needed, I think, is to sort of collate the information, which is around also in other parts of the UK, to get some understanding about what works in terms of particular prevention initiatives, and what the rates of return are, and how what kind of rollout or upscaling issues would need to be addressed, so that there can be some kind of centre of excellence, if you like, around the information to support public sector prevention, and that doesn't exist at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Now, spend to save, is one of the issues. Is of course, is you have to have the money to be able to say, well, let's take that away from existing services in order to invest it long term. And there's a real issue about the gap that we have: 2.1 billion capital, 2.6 billion as things stand in resource over the next 5 years. So, Dave, you're suggesting that taxes are increased, and you've basically said in your paper that there should be a tax review. So, for example, you've said taxing wealth and short-term via focus on particular categories of wealth while exploring options, making politics pay, scrapping or redesigning tax relief. You've already mentioned the small bonus scheme and replacing the council tax. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit more. The issue, of course, is that, for example, there's resistance at UK level. Jonathan Reynolds, for example, who was Business Secretary until last week, said it was just plain daft. 8 of the 12 countries who understand have brought in wealth taxes have since removed them because they don't feel that it actually brings in the revenue. And there's an issue about behavioural response. So some sectors such as finance, engineering have said they can't attract people to Scotland that they would like to because we already have higher tax levels. So I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a wee bit more about how this would be delivered.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is these things are more easy to deliver within what you might call unitary jurisdiction. So anything that we're talking about, it's easier to deliver at a UK level than at a Scottish level.
I think we would all accept that.
We're entirely aware of that. And actually, there's some reasonably positive examples of wealth taxes, or people moving back to wealth taxes as they are in Spain just now. And our view is that the best method or the best path for this is progressional. We think, obviously, we need the swiftest possible review of domestic valuations. That then moves on to the potential to introduce property taxation, proportional property taxation, and that in turn opens up the potential to look at wealth taxes. And as I'm sure you'll know, all of those at the moment need to be legislated for on a Scottish basis, but delivered on a local basis, which is one of the weaknesses compared to a UK-wide approach. So step one would simply make things fairer. Right? And we're talking about some of the regional disparities that we have. Step two would mean that immovable assets are subject to more tax compared to income. And step three would then allow us to say, how much can that be used to generate more taxation, as well as to reintroduce fairness and to get away from this ridiculous situation where 5 times every decade we freeze the council tax because people can't bear the thought of how iniquitous it is. And yeah, that then does move on. That is, if you like, that is your foundation then for looking at wealth taxes, because a big part of people's assets, immovable assets, are then counted. If we could agree a programme of that, and we got to progressive property taxation and said, listen, wealth taxes are quite difficult and not enough has happened at a UK level, be quite happy to discuss that. But as I say, it's a progressional approach that makes tax fairer and recognises how much wealth is now bound up in asset rather than income, and that's been a big change across the whole.
I mean, I think you make a point because, one of the issues about income tax is behavioural change. So the Scottish Fiscal Commission will say that, 80 to 90% of what the Scottish Government hope to raise with the top level of tax, they won't because of behavioural change. Not people necessarily moving elsewhere, they just decide to work fewer hours with a property tax. It's there, it can't be avoided. But at the same time, how could that be delivered without cross-party agreement? Because that's the issue, because there is no consensus about how that could effectively be delivered. And one of the reasons for that is obviously the people are concerned, particularly 6 months before an election, about the response of voters. Professor Bell said, you give people an extra £500 and they just shrug their shoulders, take £500 away from them and they're ready to lynch you. So people who gain aren't particularly impressed, but the people who lose out are extremely upset.
I can't take political responsibility for people being not prepared to stand up for the right thing, but I do recognise that it's 10 times, people are 10 times angrier when they lose a fiver than they are when they are happy when they gain a tenner. I recognise that absolutely, which is why we've been arguing for years that we need political consensus on this. And apparently there is an exception. Most of the political parties in the Parliament just now support this. And we would happily, along with other civil society organisations and the plethora, nearly everybody in Scottish civil society agrees with us about this, and nearly everybody in the Parliament agrees with us about this. So how do we unblock that? The only way, in my view, that we can unblock that is by civil society saying, come on guys, let's all have a chat about this. Let's take away the political risk from the party of government and the parties of opposition and say, listen, we just need to do this because everyone knows we need to do it. Everyone. Well,
okay. Now then, we don't have anyone else who's asked to come in, but what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to give everyone an opportunity to make a final statement, which I always like to do at a round table. And Dave, you'll be the last to make a statement because you were the first. So you'll get the last word. So in terms of the other four, if there's anything, I would like to give you the opportunity just to say anything you feel we haven't covered or something we have covered but you want to re-emphasise or whatever. This is your opportunity. So who wants to go first? If not, I'll just have to do any more. So volunteers? Mike, go on, and then Michael.
Okay. I think the one issue we haven't really covered is the transparency or otherwise of the whole process. Yeah. And I had a lot of problems myself when I came to look at the medium-term financial strategy, particularly its treatment of local government. And basically, I don't think there's enough splitting out of the forecast spend in terms of the number of portfolios which are affected. Now we will see that in the spending review, but I think it needs to go further. I mean, for example, I suppose I don't want to keep harping on about social care, but social care was treated as a spending line in its own right in the Fiscal Commission's April Fiscal Sustainability Report, which deals with the longer term rather than the medium term. And there is an issue, I think, which the Fiscal Commission mentioned in their August fiscal update about whether we should really be expecting the spending review to have a longer time horizon because of I think issues like climate change, etc., and the ongoing fiscal gap, isn't just for the next 5 years. So, it's treated as a spending line in its own right, which I think would be helpful because it's hard in the medium-term financial strategy to actually work out what the complexity of what they're actually modelling in local government, where different rates of inflation, some are based on pay rises, some are based on the GDP deflator, apply to different sub-services, whether it's staff or non-staff. And there's implied growth, which has never really actually been received in practice for demography, for social care of 3.3%. So, even as a piece of modelling, you really want the not just the spreadsheets of the tables, the spreadsheet versions of figures and things in the report, but you actually want the modelling, really. Yeah. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be put in the public domain.
To be fair, we touched on that in the kind of earlier session, but I mean, I take on board everything that you've actually said there. So, Michael, to be followed by David.
Thanks, Convener. Three quick things very quickly. It's just reflecting on discussion I heard earlier, Convener, and to kind of join your camp in terms of where we are in population health in Scotland overall. We have seen, as you said earlier, Convener, decade after decade of improvement in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. But we do know that stalled in the early 2010s and plateaued, and then from 2019 around the pandemic, population health actually got worse in Scotland and health inequalities worsened as well, as I've said. But one of the things we are really kind of bullish about in Public Health Scotland is that we should be optimistic. We have improved population health in the past and we can do it again. The stats around the smoking ban and what happened there around reduction in admissions for childhood asthma and heart attacks, the work we've done even very recently, Convener, that the committee may have not heard about, but the new RSV vaccine for pregnant women has been, even in over the last winter period, more than 200 babies weren't admitted to hospital because of RSV infections that would otherwise have been. So important population health is challenging, but there is room for optimism. The second thing, with preventative spend, Convener, I've said quite a lot about that, but I think the committee's continued weight around probing that agenda. Can we do more around identifying and tracking preventative spend? It would be really welcome. And the third issue, Convener, we've not had the chance to talk about today, but I think is important in this context, and that's the importance of action in local systems around this agenda, around how budgets are dealt with and how preventive investment is protected. We're doing work, I think I spoke about last year, with Michael Marmot and his Institute for Health Equity in 3 areas in Scotland. We call them the Collaboration for Health Equity in Scotland, in Aberdeen City, South Lanarkshire and North Ayrshire. Sheru, the institute, it's a fellow institute of the Fraser Andal Institute based at Strathclyde University, are doing interesting work with Edinburgh and North Lanarkshire. There's really interesting work going on in Clacks as well around how do you bring together partners locally, including the voluntary sector, including community, to make decisions around how to improve the well-being and health of the population. We're also a member of the Scottish Prevention Hub that's based at the Edinburgh Futures Institute at Edinburgh University with Police Scotland to think about how can we really advance this prevention agenda. And the last effort, Chair, Convener, sorry, is a really interesting piece of work I only heard about recently, but the Edinburgh Regenerative Futures Fund, which is a fund set up by Edinburgh Council with investment from the Council but also from philanthropic organisations designed to invest long-term on projects to support the health and well-being of the population of Edinburgh, with a particular focus on climate and on tackling kind of racism and allowing people from the community to take the decisions about those investment, and that investment is of 10 years duration. So there's lots happening locally around this space that I think I should have spent a bit of time on earlier, Convener. Thank you.
No, you've said it all now, and I think that's important, certainly for the record. David, to be followed by Ian.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to pick up on a point Mike was making around about transparency with the public service reform strategy. A lot of stuff there that relates to the voluntary sector that's very welcome. There's a work stream dedicated to community planning, the sector itself. There's language in there about being keen to progress the Scottish Government's fairer funding promises. Things like collaborative commissioning. That kind of stuff is all very welcome. Great language. We'd just like to see progress on it. We're not, and I think this is a point that Audit Scotland had picked up on, we're not altogether clear. There's not a whole lot of transparency around how that's going to, the progress on those things is going to be reported on. So we'd like to see that, timelines, monitoring, reporting, that kind of thing, so we can see what progress is in fact being made. And the second point I would make is to come back to how I started, which is reform. We've been talking about a lot of this stuff in involvement of the voluntary sector and delivery of public services and how that could be made better for a long time now. So we're just keen to get on and see progress. So fair funding, already talked about that. I won't bore everyone with it. Obviously the spending review is a good opportunity to see progress on that. And cracking this collaboration thing. A new formalised relationship between the Scottish Government and the voluntary sector that could be spread out to the public sector more generally, that is set in statute, that basically makes better the working relationship between the voluntary sector and the Scottish Government public services and delivery of public services. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ian, to be followed by Dave.
Yes, well, thanks for the opportunity to speak to the committee. As you said, our response is fairly narrow in its scope, focusing on the importance of walking and wheeling in relation to improving people's health and as a preventative measure. So it's been good just to expand that a bit in the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Ian. Dave, the floor is yours.
Just briefly, I compliment the committee generally on not making the mistake of implying the public sector workers and their function is a problem. Our members have gone from being superheroes 3 or 4 years ago during the pandemic to, as I say, in the public discourse from some politicians being implied to be the problem. Now, that's just not very nice, but more importantly than that, it's not a very good way to go around public sector reform, because Mike talked earlier about a particular initiative in social work that they're doing. His people are going to be motivated by managing that workload and being able to do the best job for their clients, not by the implied suggestion that this is a good way to lose one member of their staff or one colleague will go by the wayside. So how we go about this and how we involve workers and how this is framed in terms of better outcomes for the people that they care of rather than top-down budget cuts is really, really important if we're going to get the best outcome.
Thank you very much for that, and I want to thank all of our guests this afternoon. It's been a really interesting and very helpful session to the committee. So I'll now just call a break until 12:10 to allow our witnesses to change and to give members an actual break. The next item is to take evidence on 2 nominations for appointment to the Scottish Fiscal Commission. As members will be aware, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government wrote to the committee recently nominating Dr Eleanor Ryan and Justin Riccomini as Commissioners to the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Members have received copies of the nominees' CVs and the person specification for the roles. We'll take evidence first from Dr Ryan and then from Mr Riccomini, and we have around 50 minutes for this item. So I'd like to welcome Dr Eleanor Ryan to this meeting. First of all, I'd just like to thank you on your appointment, subject to parliamentary approval. I noticed that one of the things that you have in your statement is that in paragraph 10 is my consultancy business depends heavily on effective communication. I just wonder if that extends to having, submissions that are of a sufficient point size that you can actually read them, because one of the concerns I have about you and your fellow applicant is that it was so tiny, the writing in it, that short of a magnifying glass I wouldn't even be able to read it, so I had to get the clerks to increase it. So I think that's it may seem a minor point, but I think it's certainly significant. I bet you didn't think you'd be asked that.
Good afternoon, Convener, and I'm very sorry that the point size wasn't.
On to the main point of what we're actually going to say. What I want to ask you about is what is it you feel you can, what direction do you think you can take the Scottish Fiscal Commission in? Because there's quite a difference between yourself and indeed Mr Riccomini and the 2 outgoing professors, who are very much from an academic background. Your background is considerably different. An excellent CV, of course. You've been very much involved. Obviously, the establishment of Revenue Scotland, really significant, I would think, on anyone's career path. And you've got lots of experience in terms of the Scottish Government, of which you were obviously a director. So what do you think your imprint will be on the Scottish Fiscal Commission as we go forward?
My understanding is that the decision to broaden the specification for the commissioners really comes from the OECD report on the Commission and their recommendation that perhaps a broader skill set would be helpful. Personally, I spent many years in public finance, initially initially in Treasury, and then in Scotland around the time of devolution. I worked on the original devolution finance settlement. Then I did some other public service roles, including the court service, and then I returned to finance and worked, as you say, on setting up Revenue Scotland and the early budgets where the fiscal framework applied. So I think I bring could I say, a practitioner view. Mm-hmm. I understand how some of these things work within government, and I hope that will bring some richness to the analysis that the Commission will do.
So as well as your obvious abilities, you're looking to see how you can maybe broaden the outlook of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Does that mean perhaps that you feel, obviously the Scottish Fiscal Commission has got a specific remit, but even within that remit, do you feel that that allows the Commission to explore new areas of work perhaps?
So my understanding of the role of the Commission is that yes, there is scope to do more, and I think OECD was recommending that they do more around sustainability of the budget. And obviously this morning I caught just the end of the discussion that the committee's been having. There are a lot of very complex issues. A government budget, there are a lot of moving parts. So the choice of which things to look at is probably as important as the analysis itself. You could, of course, analyse everything given enough time and enough resource, but I doubt that would be helpful to the committee, and I doubt that it would be helpful to Scotland as a whole in understanding what's going on. It's finding the things that are really critical and trying to explain those, analyse and explain as clearly as possible.
And just one last question for me, actually, because colleagues are all keen to come in. It's just on the communication, which I touched on earlier on. One of the things the OECD did say was that relative to, for example, the Dutch equivalent and one or two others, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, although doing an excellent job at all levels, could do more to kind of broaden the impact it has on the Scottish media and the wider public. Now, I know that's pushing a rock uphill, because I'm not convinced that the majority of people in Scotland are necessarily interested in the fine points of the Scottish Fiscal Commission and its deliberations. But what can you do to get to enable the Fiscal Commission to have a bigger impact in terms of the the stakeholders as well as the wider public in Scotland?
So I agree that it's not an easy thing to do. I think it's extremely important. I don't think, for me, it's particularly important that people think about the Fiscal Commission and its role, but I think it's very important that there is good, transparent, accessible analysis out there to help people understand these very complex issues. Mm-hmm. Things like climate change, things like budget gaps over time, tax choices. My experience is that if you want to reach some of the groups who you don't traditionally reach, you have to ask them and work with them. You have to go and find people and actually listen to them about and talk to them about what is possible, hear from them what they're interested in, and navigate a way through. I think my experience is, if you want to communicate with different stakeholder groups, you have to ask them what works.
Okay, thank you very much. Michael, to follow by John.
Thank you, Convener. Less concerns about my own eyesight to start off with in comparison to Convener. But could you tell me, what do you believe are the most significant medium-term risks to the Scottish economy?
Oh my. So, with the caveat that I'm not an economist, I think there are some there's some known issues about productivity and demographics, which Scotland shares to some extent with other Western economies, but the health issues in Scotland are, I think, more acute. There are big technological disruptions going on at the moment with the rise of AI. I don't think we understand fully what that's going to do. That could be a great benefit, or it could be a disbenefit. And there's obviously climate change, which everyone is having to grapple with also. I don't know that these are all necessarily all downside, but they are all big issues that need to be addressed.
And how would you foresee the impact of those kind of challenges flowing through the fiscal framework?
Through a fiscal framework? Yeah. Well, as you know, the big issue with the fiscal framework is that everything is calculated for Scotland with reference to the UK. So one of the things that needs to be thought about is how Scotland chooses to respond relative to how the UK chooses to respond to some of these things. So if the UK makes certain tax and spend choices, for instance, we've heard recently about increase in defence spending, but we don't know yet how the UK government will fund that, and whether that will be tax increases, whether that will be cuts to other spending. We don't know so because we don't know that, we don't know how that will flow through the fiscal framework. And the same thing happens, I think, around climate change response and tax and spend choices that the UK government makes. So I think it is one of the challenges for the Scottish government and the Scottish budget is you want to be free to make the choices, use the powers that have been devolved and are there, but you have to be mindful of the relative impact of the choices in Scotland relative to the choices made at UK level. I think that's where the Fiscal Commission can help a bit to unpack some of that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. John, to follow by Ross.
Thank you. I mean, just following on that point then, I mean, do you not think you'll find it frustrating that you and your colleagues will be able to, make forecasts for several years ahead, and then something happens in the current year that just kind of turns it all upside down?
I mean, yes, but it is, I think, the way of government. It's to some extent, it is exacerbated, I think, by the circumstances of the fiscal framework. But I think for all governments, governments of independent countries also can make their forecasts and then be hit with something that they weren't expecting, like COVID or some kind of economic shock. So the need to respond to whatever is happening, to new information coming in, I think exists in all systems. It's perhaps just a little more complicated in this one.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, the Scottish budget's coming up quite soon. Well, UK budget followed by the Scottish budget. There's going to be quite a lot of time pressure around December, January. You're relaxed about that?
Relaxed, perhaps not, but ready to help in any way if I'm appointed. Absolutely.
And I mean, the convener asked you kind of one of the things I was going to ask, which is about this whole idea of financial literacy throughout society, which actually I think includes the MSPs, but I'll not necessarily ask you to deal with that. Well, that's the MSPs who are not on this committee, of course. I noted the point you made in your submission that about communicating with very different kinds of audiences. Yes. And so just to go a little bit further with that, I mean, as a society, should we be doing more in the schools to kind of get young people thinking about these things, or should we move forward?
So I think it is good to get more people thinking about it at all levels, and I agree that it would be sensible to start with young people. Again, it isn't straightforward. We did do some work on, when I was involved in Revenue Scotland, we did some work on tax and tax policy and trying to have conversations through Young Scot with young people about tax. They were interesting, but I think we needed to do more. Should more be done in school? I did, many years ago, have policy responsibility for the school curriculum, and so I do know that the answer to many things is seen to be to put more into the school curriculum, and there's a finite amount of time. Of course, personally, I'd like to see more on financial literacy, but I appreciate that decisions around school curriculum are quite tricky to fit everything in.
So, I mean, who should be taking responsibility for this agenda? I mean, should it be the government? Should it be us as Parliament? Should it the Fiscal Commission, or is it just a kind of mixture of all of us?
I would suggest that we all need to play a part in it. I think the Commission has an important role in being an independent commentator, providing input and ideally to groups, all different groups of society, to help them understand and navigate some of these difficult things. But I don't think the Commission could possibly do it on its own, and I think it's important that government communicates well. I think it's important that the Parliament communicates well.
And use the word independent. Now, you used to be very close to government, if not part of it.
I was. Yes.
Are you comfortable about now being on a different side of the fence? You are independent?
I've been independent for the last 6 years. I left the civil service in 2019, and I've done work now in Scotland and internationally, and I have to write reports and present my independent view. I've become much more comfortable with that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Convener.
So do you consider yourself a poacher now or a gamekeeper? Ross, to followed by Michelle.
Thanks, Convener. Good afternoon. John's last question actually was going to be mine about part of our responsibility here is making sure that we're guarding against groupthink. You mentioned the importance of the SFC being independent. That sometimes requires being pretty robust with the government, and you can take it either way in terms of appointing someone who has that extensive experience from within government of either there is that danger of groupthink, or you know where all the bodies are buried, you've got all that years of experience of frustration inside the system. So assuming it's the latter, do you have any examples of processes that the government undertakes, particularly in relation to the budget and its own fiscal forecasting, that after leaving government you thought, my God, why did we do it that way? Or that you're now excited to have the opportunity to perhaps put pressure on the government to take a different approach in relation to?
So I was involved in the first medium-term financial strategy, and indeed the second one, which the government produced. I know that has continued to evolve since I left. I think you've been discussing some of that recently. I think there's a lot more that could be done there to set out more clearly what the direction of travel could be, what the choices are, what government's intending to do. So I'd love to see that built on and expanded. Are there things that I would want the government to stop doing? It isn't really stop doing. I think we were talking about transparency earlier, and I think transparency is complicated because it's not just putting lots of information out there. The government does, in fact, publish a lot of information. It's publishing information in an accessible form, and I think there's more that could be done there as well, and I'd be delighted to work with the government to try to improve the accessibility of the financial information it publishes.
And on MTFS, you mentioned as an example, you're talking about kind of laying out options. By that, do you mean for the government to set out clearly what its intentions are, or is this like kind of scenario planning, laying out here are the options that would be available over the long term to close our fiscal gap, either through spending cuts, tax rises, etc.? Because those are there's merit to both approaches. It would be valuable for Parliament and the public to know what the current government's intentions are, but in terms of particularly the kind of public economic literacy point that the convener was talking about, understanding what the levers available to the government are is also important, regardless of which one any government any given time pulls on.
Yes. So I think the medium-term financial strategy document is never going to be the full answer, because things like spending reviews and the budgets that are presented are the full answer, but they should show a direction of travel. Personally, I think there's value in showing scenarios or highlighting different possible choices. But equally, that's something that the Commission can do. So I think there's something for the Commission and to do, working with this committee and working with the government to try to ensure that the overall picture is presented and people understand about the choices that are possible, and then can put the final choices that are made into context. But I don't think it's all one. It's all got to be done by one or the other.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Convener.
Michelle.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us. I mean, obviously, I read your CV with interest as well, and there's no denying the depth of your hinterland. But I suppose, following on from the question that Ross asked, to what extent do you regard your depth of knowledge kind of built over many years as an opportunity, and to what extent do you regard it as a risk, because you're very steeped in a prevailing culture of thinking, particularly linking back to Treasury, and Treasury's hands reach, its tentacles rather, reach everywhere? What's your assessment of risk and opportunity with your own CV and hinterland?
I think that's a very good question. So I've had some time to be outside of government and to see things from an external perspective. I've been lucky enough to work overseas with some World Bank teams on aspects of public procurement and so on, and to see how things work in other countries. I would not try to suggest that the way that Treasury does things is the only way or the right way. I understand quite a lot of why things are the way they are. That isn't the same thing as thinking they ought to be that way. I think it would have been a big risk to go from government straight into a role like this. But I think, having had some time to be independent and think around it, I hope I would bring a much more balanced view. And I also, of course, would not be the only person if I were lucky enough to be appointed. I'd be working with two very experienced economists and with another member of the Commission. And so one of the things that I think is that I understand to be a strength of the Scottish Fiscal Commission is the debate and the challenge and the testing that goes on within there. So I don't think I would be a huge risk, because I think there would be other points of view to balance mine, and I think my own is more balanced than it was.
Okay, thank you for that. And just Following on from that, I mean, I remember bringing up the need for women commissioners with Graham Roy probably in 2021. And so following on from that, many people are blindsided because they stop and forget, or rather they forget about systemic issues flowing through economics that affect women, and we tend not to gather supporting data that allow for various hypotheses. I'd just be interested in what you think you can bring to the table that, you know, because Professor Roy's done a very good job, in my opinion, thus far, starting to broaden out the work of the Fiscal Commission, but I'm just wondering what you think you can bring to the table in that regard, because it still seems like quite a gap that we don't always ask the question about, but what does the data tell us about women? Oh, well, we don't have that data. Well, what can we do about that to start to understand some systemic issues, never mind trying to change them?
I'm sure you'll be well aware of the wonderful book by Caroline Criado Perez,
Yes.
Invisible Women. I was very lucky to hear her speak about it on one occasion. I absolutely agree with you. I think we're quite bad about having data that fully understand, not just in economics and finance, but in many walks of life, about understanding the impact on women and indeed the impact on other groups in society. I think it's a very important question to ask, and something I'd be very happy to explore with the Commission if I were appointed. I don't know what I can do at this point, but it's definitely something I'd be interested in.
Well, should you be appointed, you can look forward to being asked by myself in future sessions.
That's fine.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. That's concluded questions from the committee. Are there any points you would wish to make, or anything you feel we should know that we don't already?
Only to say that it is such an honour to be here at all, and I would be delighted to be appointed if the committee considers that's acceptable.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your attendance today. We really appreciate it. I'll now just call a 2-minute break till a changeover of. I welcome to the meeting Justin Rickamini, also nominated as Commissioner to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and as before we'll move straight to questions. I think you're really going to be going in the deep end here. We found out just a few days ago that the UK budget will be on the 26th of November, which is probably later than was envisaged. I think many of us thought it might be a couple of weeks earlier, for example. So I'm just wondering, you know, what that challenge means to you and how you feel you and your colleagues will respond to that if you are appointed.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me along to this hearing. The budget date shocked me, and I've been in tax for 37 years now. So actually, yeah, it was a pretty shocking late date. And in terms of my hopefully potential role at the Commission, I think we've basically just got to cancel Christmas because there's going to be a lot of work to do over that period. But that's okay. It's only one day.
And how do you feel such a late date for a budget might impact on scrutiny, not just of this committee, but wider scrutiny?
I've always kind of advocated to the UK government to try and produce budgets in the earlier part of the autumn if they could, because of the impact on the devolved nations as well, and their ability to prepare and debate the necessary issues before the end of the tax year. Especially on the situation with income tax, for example, when it needs to, the rate resolution needs to be passed before the 6th of April, really. So, it's a late budget brings its own stresses, it brings its own issues. You have to react more quickly, probably, analyse things with alacrity, and make sure that you are responding in a responsible and stable way.
I mean, I understand that the devolved administrations weren't advised of the change of date, let alone consulted on, but you actually have got some excellent relationships, for example, with other devolved administrations such as the Welsh Government. I just wonder if you can talk about what advantages you think that might provide to the Fiscal Commission, that the experience with those in terms of the work that you'll do if you're appointed going forward.
Yes, thank you. The relationships that I've been having in my tax policy role over the last decade have been really fantastic in terms of the opportunity to work and collaborate and be a trusted advisor as well to Scottish Government officials, Welsh Government officials, working with my colleagues and my counterparts around the UK, like the CIOT or the Low Income Tax Reforms Group, etc. So actually I've made lots and lots of really good and stable connections that I think I can probably call upon in future, because I've been to the meetings and I know the people. So.
In the last year or two, the Scottish Fiscal Commission has kind of expanded some of its area of work, and it's had some really important documents like the long-term fiscal sustainability, climate change, etc. Are there any new directions or new focus that you feel you could take the Fiscal Commission in, maybe to do something, perhaps another area of work?
I think at the moment I don't really know what I don't know the inner workings of the Fiscal Commission because I don't work there. So I think what it would be an opportunity for us to all to collaborate and bring new ideas to the table. I mean, you've just mentioned sort of climate change and sustainability. I think that in those areas there's a real opportunity for Scotland to actually become a world leader in sort of renewables and things like that. It's already made a huge mark. So I think that there's a potential there to actually work out how that can sort of productively raise money and increase the benefits to the Scottish economy.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues are keen to come in, so first will be Michelle, followed by Michael.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I noticed on your CV that you're a non-exec board member of Paragon Music Limited.
I was, yes.
Yeah, so that's slightly different to all your other experiences. What was your interest in that and why, given it's slightly different?
Okay. Well, I'm a trained classical singer, so I can sing opera as well, so I'm not going to do it right now. You'll be glad to hear. But I became involved with Paragon because I was singing with a quintet of musicians, and one of the musicians, the bassist, was the sort of CEO, if you like, of Paragon Music. So he invited me to be on the board, and because of my sort of areas of tax and HR, employment law stuff, I basically sort of led on that for that organisation while I was a non-exec there. And it was really, really rewarding.
And do you think that alternative experience, and I suppose one might refer to as kind of cognitive diversity, is something that you'll be able to bring to the perhaps slightly dry subject matter of the Scottish Fiscal Commission?
Dry? I find it thrilling.
We find it exciting, but hey.
Yeah. I keep telling people that tax rules the world. I'm not sure they believe me, but it does really. Yeah, I mean, I think that my experience of working with Paragon was really mind-changing, and it really broadened my horizons as an individual, because I don't actually have any members of my own family or friends who have any kind of like disabilities or learning difficulties or any of those kind of things. So it was really, really wonderful for me to work with those people. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And actually, I think all the experiences that I've had throughout my career to date have taken me in so many different directions that I can call upon those experiences now and use them wisely and effectively at the Fiscal Commission.
And I noticed as well your kind of application, you make the statement, I've called out bad or dishonest practices. Yeah. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting you to cite individual examples today, but I'm very interested that you deliberately chose to do that. Is that because you're, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'd be interested in your view of ethics. Yeah. And also the fact that you sought to put this in your application. It would be useful to understand a bit more about why you felt that was sufficiently important.
I think, as far as I'm concerned, I've got, and I hope that other people also think that I've got a very strong moral compass. I've always had that. It was imbibed into me by my own parents. And I think that, on the ethics front, I've always upheld very strong ethical values, and I appreciate fairness, and I appreciate sort of diversity and people being treated according to their own needs and abilities. So actually, I think that's why I found my role when I was doing HR and employment law consulting work, that I found that so rewarding as well, because I felt that I was able to bring something else to the party there.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, you were privy to some of the questions to the last candidate, but can I ask then, perhaps in a slight different tangent but in the same area, what would you believe to be the domestic performance issues rather than the global trends that will perhaps impact on the performance of the Scottish economy over the medium term?
So in Scotland, domestic issues, I think when I actually spoke to the interview panel, I put forward some thoughts on what I thought perhaps were some of the main issues that might be affecting in the sort of short, medium term, really. And just to sort of build on what Eleanor was saying as well, I think that one of the issues, not just in Scotland, it's in other countries as well, but in Scotland it's particularly prevalent, I think, is the issue of population decline, and also the overall health of the Scottish populace. So it was really interesting to just catch the end of that last roundtable. And the 50-year forecast that the Scottish Fiscal Commission produced in 2023 did set out some areas of sort of concern and things to think about on that area. So I think that that's a really important issue, because as a tax person as well, you need to know where your next tax base is coming from and how that tax base is going to fare. So if people are falling ill at an early age and dropping out of the workforce and no longer being kind of taxpayer people, then obviously the tax base is shrinking. So that's, in terms of sort of tax and spend, that's an absolutely crucial point, really. And I think the other point, just to try and be as brief as possible, really, was the kind of the comparative size of the public sector in Scotland, and how that compares to the relative health of the Scottish tax base and how it all fits in with the sort of spending priorities for the Scottish Government over the next few years. It's definitely something to look at in terms of a trajectory.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. To be followed by Craig.
Thanks very much. I mean, clearly the SFC up till now has had a very focus on having economists as the commissioners. Do you see this as good or bad, that we're kind of widening out a bit?
I think it's excellent.
I mean, come on.
I'm asking the question. How do you think it strengthens the SFC?
No, I mean, I'll be honest with you. You know, it's. I think it's a really bold move. I really do. I mean, when you think of the Scottish Fiscal Commission and the 4 professors, you think, right, it's an economist's world.
Yes.
It's about economics, etc. But I think that actually the OECD recommendations and actually the foresight of Professor Roy to actually decide to take this forward has been a step in the right direction. And I really, really hope that if I'm appointed as a commissioner, that I can really bring something different to the table and think, you know, new thoughts, new ideas and new perspectives, because I remember when I had the interview for this role, we were discussing about not necessarily groupthink, because it's not, the Scottish Fiscal Commission isn't a bad organisation or a toxic one, but actually I think if you've got 4 economists in a room, they're probably likely to talk about economic things rather than other influences. So, and I recognise that they're all absolutely brilliant and amazing people, but sometimes your discussions can go down a path and stay there, rather than actually somebody saying, hang on, what about this or what about that? So that, I think that might be my role.
Okay, well, that sounds good. Thank you. We talked earlier, but it's quite a big issue, the whole thing about communicating with the public, obviously experts as well. The point's been made before, but the Fiscal Commission needs to relate to a very wide range of people. Have you any thoughts on this idea of communication? You know, I think we feel there's been improvements over the years, but it's still quite a challenge getting the public generally engaged in this kind of space.
Yeah, I definitely. It's definitely difficult because as a tax geek, as I would classify myself, you know, people don't really want to talk about tax in Britain until or unless they're forced to do so, or a brown letter arrives on the doorstep or something, and they have to face reality.
Amen.
It's quite. It's never an easy subject to try and engage people in tax. I know that as a tax practitioner. You know, trying to talk to a client that doesn't want to talk about tax is pretty hard going.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it's absolutely vital for. I've been advocating through ICAS when I was at ICAS, which I started my new role at Tolley on the 1st of July. So when I was at ICAS, one of the things that I was constantly advocating for was to try to bring more clarity, more transparency, and not necessarily simplicity, but explaining things to people about tax and finances and the economy in a language that they can understand. And I have to say I applaud the Fiscal Commission on its reports, because the infographics are excellent. You know, the language is fairly clear and fairly plain. And if you're the man on the Clapham omnibus, you can probably get a fair grasp of what they're saying, as long as nobody asks you about it afterwards and you've got to explain it to somebody else. But actually, I think there's a need for that in the whole of the UK, actually. But in Scotland, it would be a privilege to be able to try to expand people's education in that area without sounding condescending, of course. Yeah. That's, you know.
I think it's a big challenge, so it's encouraging that you see that as well. And finally, you used the word simplicity there, and I think you did work for the Office of Tax Simplification at one point. Was that successful?
Well, it's not there anymore, is it? So that's kind of a moot point, really. But I think we did what we were commissioned to do by various different. I worked for 2 different chancellors on 2 different projects.
So you're there a whole month then here?
I did a whole month.
Yeah. Do you know the number of chances we had in 23?
It wasn't the shortest lived one. But actually, it was a really, really great thing to do, actually, because working with the guys at the Treasury and the DBT and HMRC and everybody else was at that kind of policy level was really supremely interesting. And the research that we did, I felt, was extremely kind of independent, unbiased, and, you know, actually presenting the facts that ministers really needed to know about. And the deadline was always budget day, so that the minister could announce it in his speech. So, yeah, it's a shame that it's not still there doing its job. I've been assured that it's being imbibed into everything that gets done now.
Okay, well, I'm certainly interested in the area, but I accept it's not the SFC's main thing at the moment. Thanks very much, Convener.
Thanks, John. Craig, to be followed by Ross.
Thank you, and good morning, or good afternoon it is now. I noticed in your CV that you said you have no time for hubris and complacency.
That's right.
I think that both lead to stagnation, I think poor decision-making, and ultimately a downfall. So I suspect interfacing with politicians in the next 12 months might be quite interesting in respect of that. But what do you think, particularly in relation to public finances and long-term projections, what impact do you think hubris and complacency will have, and how can the Fiscal Commission work with us to make sure that this government displays neither?
Well, I think the role of the Commission is to, you know, as part of its corporate plan, is to make ministers absolutely as aware as possible as they can, given the information that they have to hand, of the risks that are presented, not just financial risks, reputational risks. You know, there's lots and lots of different kinds of risk, isn't there? But actually, I think it's really important to make sure that ministers are absolutely as aware as they possibly can be, so that they can make sound and rational decisions with the information that they've got. You can't really do any more than that.
Can you think of a personal example where you did draw a minister or a government's attention to risks in clear, vivid terms, and how responsive do they tend to be to those? Because generally they're smart people, advised by smart people, and sometimes maybe they're prepared to take those risks.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just trying to keep politics out of it, I mean, I've had quite a lot of conversations over the years with ministers in Scotland and in the UK, and, you know, that includes like the House of Lords and things like that, just giving them not necessarily the best news about what some policies have actually resulted in happening. I think, you know, bringing to their attention things like I think the convener mentioned behavioural impacts a little bit earlier as well. I think you could just try to sort of talk to them in realistic terms without there being any need for kind of argument, aggression, or indeed bringing politics into it. Yeah. The facts should really speak for themselves.
And obviously you're not in post yet, so perhaps you can be a little bit more open in respect of that. Going back to Mr Mason's point in relation to simplicity within the tax system, you're aware that the Scottish income tax system, there are more rates than the rest of the UK, including a starter rate that goes from 12,571 to 15,397, which is just 1 pence in the pound less than that. One of the things that various organisations, including ICAS and others, have mentioned at the point in time is that the complexity is not necessarily helpful within the tax system. Is that the sort of complexity that you would be advocating Scottish ministers look again at, given the relatively small difference it actually makes to the tax take and to taxpayers?
I mean, I think tax in itself is a fairly political subject, and tax rates in themselves are extremely political, and it's not something that I've ever commented on before. because we didn't really, in the same way as, you know, my counterpart policy people didn't in other organisations, because it's just too political. But what you can do is paint a picture of what policy decisions might lead to, and then maybe a year, 2 years down the line, look at the facts, look at the figures, look at the outturn reports, etc., and see, are we able to actually identify behavioural responses or complications, etc. I think in terms of complexity, tax is complicated. It's particularly complicated in the UK. When I first started, I was just saying to Eleanor when we were waiting to come in, when I started in tax, the tax books were about this big, and now they're kind of this big. So, you know, we haven't done anything to try and reduce the amount. But actually, there is a way of making... I've always tried to when I've done webinars, seminars, etc., for members, for clients, for other people, I've even, you know, universities, schools, etc., where I've spoken, I've tried to make a complex subject sound reasonably simple, so just so that people can understand it at their level. So to me, it doesn't really matter if you have 6 rates and bands or 3 or 10, because, you know, they have that in France. So why, you know, it's about understanding what happens with those rates and bands and what people pay, and that's what people really want to know. Yeah. And if you can make that fairly sort of understandable, then people take it on board. But what it really does do is just create a little bit more admin.
Thank you. Ross.
I'm all good. Convener, my questions were about the Office of Tax Simplification and Principles of Simple Systems, so I think that's been well covered.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Gomini. I'm just wondering if you get any further points you want to make to the committee before we wind up.
No, just to kind of repeat what Eleanor said before, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think it's a great honour to have been even recommended for this role. And if I'm allowed to carry it out, I would do it to the absolute best of my ability and dedicate myself to it.
Well, thank you very much for that. And we will decide in private session later this afternoon where to agree the appointments, and we'll then make a recommendation to Parliament. That concludes the public part of today's meeting. We now move into private session. I'll just call a 2-minute break and to enable our witnesses, broadcasting and official vote to leave. Thank you.